We're back. Tell me you're joking. Got another episode here for you guys. Joining me today, one of LinkedIn's most prolific algorithm busters.
We'll see.
I made that up. And Dave Messner, how you doing, man?
I'm doing fantastic. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, man. No, it's let's kind of set the table for the listeners here because they're gonna read their dashboard. They're gonna be like, okay, cool, development, St. Louis et al. And however I title it at the time of titling, and they're gonna be like, Dave Messner, who's that? And first thing I'm gonna say is, he did not go to high school here.
I did not.
Which is immediately gonna scare a lot of people. Like,
but you know what's weird about that is, so I grew up in Southern California, and it is unique to ask what high school you went to. But in Southern California, it's area codes, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we got Nate Dogg area codes, different song, but you know when somebody has an 818 area code, that's why, the Kardashian girl, it's 818 tequila.
Yeah.
It's because the area code communicates something.
What do you think is the most famous area code in the country? We think it's 314, but it's not. If you had to double down, which is it?
I think it's 818. I
think it's three-way race. I think it's 212, 312, and 818.
I think so much of that, it matters very locally where you are. Yeah. And I the older I get, the more I realize that more and more people are looking for a way to tribalize in an interesting way. Some of that is sort of fast tracking, not necessarily to how do I exclude you, but
right.
How do I find some common ground, right? And I think that's one of the things that the dam broke for me in December with just a lot of the St. Louis news. Being here for 10 years is recognizing that so many of the obstacles in the region, so many of the obstacles politically, environment right now, and here we are in February dealing with a lot of crazy stuff, and it's.
So you're saying the political environment is kind of chaotic right now?
A little bit, yeah, I think so.
Haven't noticed.
But you know what's weird to me though is because I think back. I grew up in kind of a weird way. So.
Yeah, Southern California, right?
Southern California, which is obviously inherently weird, right? Especially for somebody here. My dad worked for a company called Fannie Mae for 25 years.
Sure.
And
home loans, financing.
Home loans, and he worked in multifamily, so a little different spot.
Right.
Most people know Fannie Mae because of the global financial crisis, and that was sort of a tangential piece there, and that's a whole other podcast that we're not here for.
Right.
But both he and my mom grew up in Southern California, so before I left, we were kind of third and fourth generation Southern California, which is interesting because if you go look at pictures of Southern California in the 1900s, it's the desert. Mm-hmm. But I grew up traveling and kind of transversing Southern California on a regular basis and having my dad almost as a tour guide to say, point things out and say, hey, this used to be a mid-rise kind of poor neighborhood and now it's kind of grown up, or this used to be a commercial district and now it's a subdivision. I think that really gave me a lot of the perspective for two things. One is that instinctual kind of sense for how people move and real estate develops, just kind of knowing how that is. And the second thing is understanding that things change over time and so much of it is organic, but you have to create the environment to let things happen.
Right. No, I agree with that. Because going back to one of the earlier things you pointed out was the tribalism.
Yeah.
Our need, desire to create it. Even though it's so cliche, like, why can't we all get along? Well, the reality is we all came from a small space.
Yeah.
And then throughout our lives, we're kind of, we're either good or adept at integrating into larger spaces. And other, well, now we're getting into like, the literary world, right? Theoretical spaces and cultures and all that. I don't want to get in the weeds there, but the reality is, these communities that we were talking about earlier, LA, Chicago, New York in particular, and by default now St. Louis, which is where we are. Those three communities, they're just, you can't define them. Is really where I'm going with this.
Sure.
They are great due to their massing, and they get a whole lot of things right. But it's way more fun to talk about the things they get wrong, which brings me to our backyard, which was one of the reasons I tagged you on LinkedIn and reached out. Your current title, according to LinkedIn, assuming you have that updated.
Reasonably updated, yeah.
New Legacy Development Partners. You are the partner, acquisitions and development. Give me the 30-second on exactly what the day job is, because I want to kind of set the table for our listeners so that as we get into some of the things that are occurring within St. Louis, St. Louis region, St. Louis downtown, county, et cetera, I want to kind of tie it together.
So the day job's a little different now. For the last 5 years, I've been partnered up, redeveloping Laclede's Landing, while in conjunction, dodging, weaving, ducking, diving, making it through historic tax credit changes, making it through COVID, making it through low interest and high interest lending environments. And I'm departed. I'm doing other things now, and that includes doing a podcast with you and kind of thinking about what comes next. While I was doing that, I was also doing another business out in Herman, Missouri, which was short-term rentals. And that was interesting because as we faced a ton of challenges during COVID and everything being locked down in downtown in St. Louis, Herman was wide open for business. I mean, they've never seen a better year or two than they did out then.
No, I mean, you didn't get the memo?
Yeah.
COVID doesn't cross county lines out there.
And it doesn't go on the trains, and it doesn't take the bus. I mean, it was a madhouse out there, which was phenomenal, and it really, in a lot of ways, gave a lifeline to everything we were trying to do. And I think a lot of the results you're seeing there now, which is just really exciting. And I think along with what like Alex Oliver's doing on Wash Ave and some of the other projects, it's really a relief to see things happening.
Are you still active in Herman?
I'm not. I exited Herman last year. You know, the market changed, and I think what it really taught me was our problems in St. Louis are the same, are the different side of the coin as they have in small town Missouri.
Right.
And I think, you know, I go back, you know, we were talking about kind of how I grew up. You know, I did my undergrad in history at Southern Methodist University in Dallas, and there I learned there's kind of two kinds of historians, generally in a bucket. There are historians that are really put an emphasis on facts, and that's really great, and it's important, right? Facts are really important, and it can make people seem really smart when they can rattle off some facts, but sometimes you can name facts outside of context, and if you miss the context and sort of those weaving and overlappings in the tapestry of history, you're telling an incomplete story. And that's the side that I'm on, is really more of the social and the tapestry side. My recall is not terrific, so I won't be citing a bunch of facts and quotes and this or that.
No, that's good, because this is social media.
Yeah.
You're not required to provide facts.
And people don't think like that.
You're in luck.
And people don't think like that. You know, I think most people, you know, I always try to think of how do you explain things to a layperson who doesn't find this stuff interesting? It impacts them, and it's important, but they're not paying attention to it, not because they're not intelligent enough to. It's just, it can be so overwhelming, these issues,
Right.
that where do I even start, right? You know,
let me ask you just a personal question then. The why, you grew up in Southern California, you go to SMU, you get your degree, you get your graduate, you meet a girl from St. Louis, and inevitably they pull you back here. And we did put an asterisk next to that because Wildwood is
right.
Yeah, I'll give, for the sake of our conversation, we'll say she's from St. Louis,
and I'm here, right?
yeah, right. And you get into eventually, it's kind of the core part of your quote career development.
Yeah.
Leaning into two diametrically opposed areas, that being Herman, Missouri is unique. The Landing, downtown St. Louis, is completely unique for a multitude of other reasons.
Sure.
So other than the desire to make money via real estate and development, why development as a focus?
So there's two pieces. And I go back to that conversation we're having about my dad showing me around Los Angeles. Is if you put into a bucket so many of the issues of our time, generational equity, long-term savings or no savings in the case of a lot of baby boomers, and even just economically today, even if we wished it to be different, real estate has captured the majority of the individual American's lifeblood. It's home, it's the piggy bank, it's our kind of weekend activity, right? If you're the Midwesterner about the lawn, like that's a thing. And I think you can tell a lot of the story about American history through real estate. And so my appreciation in the kind of the foray into development started with this appreciation and a long-term observation of the transformational power of real estate done well. The second is, I love these old buildings. They tell a story. You know, when I go into a lot of these old buildings, the bricks and sticks are interesting, but I get more excited about the stuff that gets left behind.
Yeah.
Who was there before us? What was there? I brought you some desk art. I heard that in the last podcast.
Yeah.
One of the buildings at the Landing was the old Judge Coffee Building. And, you know, each one of those buildings tells a little bit of a different story. But, you know, at one point at the Landing, they were roasting 3 million pounds of coffee a year at a time when the Americans were not drinking a lot of coffee. St. Louis, the joke in Dallas when I was there was if you looked at all the skyscrapers, you could count how many insurance companies used to be downtown.
Right.
When you look around St. Louis, I see all these brick buildings. And the answer is, that's how many small businesses used to be here.
Well, like, you know, extrapolate out, if you zoom out really on numbers, simplicity of numbers, right? City of St. Louis at its peak was roughly 950,000 people. As of the last census and updates, we're at, you know, there's debate, but it's pennies at this point. We're talking 275,000 to 285,000, give or take. That's a precipitous drop. That 70% of your population is gone. So my question to you is, you know, when you look at the infrastructure, you look at the footprint, you look at the size, because for the most part, it's a big city, you know, for that kind of a number, you know, compared to where we were. But when you look at the Landing in particular, what motivates you to want to go into an area where you see 50 years of numbers that are telling you, you know, hold on, take a deep breath, because the bar chart is in the red.
Sure.
Talk about the why, you know, maybe the Landing in particular, because we can go anywhere around the city and find beautiful architecture and great stories, but there's few that are actually activating. The Landing is one of those. Why?
Give me some rope to kind of extrapolate through a comparison. So when we initially went down to the Landing, one of the things that was enticing about it was, one, the availability to get a critical mass. And I think you see that now with what Oliver Group is doing on Wash Ave. You can do a lot when you can kind of lock down a couple blocks and control the environment in a way that is, hey, we know that in this defined area, there's enough positive things that are going to happen in order for us to enact change. At the Landing, it is a discrete neighborhood with 2 or 3 ways in or out that is directly adjacent to the Gateway Arch Park. The only other place that is even reasonably similar to this is Choto's Landing, which is now Gateway South. Now, it's got its own other logistical questions about it, but you know, in terms of riverfront properties and ability to build a collection of properties, there was really nothing else like this. And even in other cities, what people don't understand about St. Louis is even if you go to Kansas City, the same properties that we have here for $30-$40 a foot are $60-$70 a foot. You go to Chattanooga, similar properties. They're twice as expensive. You go to Louisville, they're twice as expensive. And so that's what allowed us to do it. That was the attraction to do it, is to be able to get enough critical mass to make a significant change. And I think in the next couple of years, as those properties like finish and the confidence around downtown starts to change, you're going to see those numbers go up. Now, I'm going to tell a different story about this. And this is where, when I first got to St. Louis, I worked at the St. Louis Regional Chamber, which is now Greater STL Inc. And that sort of gave me an interesting 30,000-foot view of how things are being thought about across the region. And I'll paint with a broad brush. And I think
let me help listeners too, because at the time in which excuse me, you had been working with them, we still had 7, 8, 9, 10, 12, 15 organizations that were all down in literally the same 2-mile radius. all trying to do the same thing. So we had a lot of fiefdoms that all had the quote best ideas to develop the areas, and there was no clear-cut leader. Let's just put it that way.
Sure.
The initial iteration of Greater St. Louis Inc. was one of many.
Correct. And I think if you go back, that is not unique to a lot of other places. That's not unique to St. Louis that we have all these little fiefdoms.
Sure.
My experience, not from being here, is that one of the major drawbacks to this region is not what high school did you go to. It's, well, you're not from here. And so what could you possibly have to say about this place? And I think you can extrapolate that to all the neighborhoods in North and South City. You can extrapolate it to the county. You can extrapolate it to the region. And so there's a gatekeeping that I think is fear-based, and not fear like, oh, I'm just scared of change, but fear-based in a lot of cases, which is, okay, if we start to do things differently and they work, what will it say about the strategy that we've taken over a very long period of time?
Sure.
That we did not get those results. And
it's pro sports. There's a reason why there's not a lot of relationships amongst players, amongst teams in pro sports, is because every single person that's on that roster is fighting for the same dollars you are. And so whenever a better player comes into a locker room, there's potential risk, A, and B, that tells you that, quote, ownership believes that who's in here now isn't doing good enough. That's what happens. And here I'm agreeing with you.
Yeah.
Because this is what St. Louis does.
But I think it's more existential than that. Let me characterize this through a story with my wife for a second, and she gave me permission to share this story, so this isn't going to be a surprise to her. So,
does it have to do with what's that ski mountain out there?
Yeah, Hidden Valley.
Yeah,
it does not. Fortunately,
okay. Proceed.
So my experience growing up in Southern California is this is a dynamic place that is constantly seeking for novelty and more. Not in necessarily the hedonistic way that gets characterized all the time, but there's a sense of, you think about the story of Arnold Schwarzenegger. I show up with nothing, and this place gives me everything, and it gives me that opportunity. And so I think you meet people from the West Coast, and there's a sense, and it's the same thing in New York, just different characterization, where there's a sense of wanting for more and striving for better, and early in our relationship, my wife and I had this conflict where I would say, oh my gosh, I can't wait until I have enough for an S class, or I can't wait until we can get, a second house and, near the mountains or the beach or something like that. And she'd get so mad, and I never understood what it was. And from her perspective, which I don't know if this characterizes the Midwest or St. Louis or both of them, but this is kind of the way she felt and the way I would maybe paint with a broad brush, is when I would say, I can't wait until we have enough to get an S class or a sports car, something like that, what she heard was, I don't appreciate and I am unsatisfied with what I have now. Mm-hmm. And that means that therefore I or we are not valuable or unworthy or something else where, and when she said it, I totally understood it. And I think if you kind of extrapolate that out and use it to the extreme in this region, I think that's where we are. And I'll share a story when I first got to the St. Louis Regional Chamber. So I showed up, bright-eyed, bushy-tailed. I said, oh my gosh, you got all these amazing assets. You don't capitalize on the riverfront. What's going on here? And one of the people I talked to, they said, well, we really look at the riverfront as kind of more of an industrial area. And, the region just it just really hasn't been the same since the Chrysler plant moved out of Fenton.
Yeah. So an industrial area in which we don't have any industry.
Right. Yeah.
So we have a theoretical space that looks industrial, and therefore we're not going to touch it, even though we don't have any industry in the, what most cities that are on rivers absolutely monetize ad nauseum.
Cleveland just announced a $3.9 billion riverfront transformation. It's incredible.
Yeah.
I'll take that one step further. As we were working on a plan back in 2019 to redevelop that North Riverfront section where the stadium was going to go. And even today, you'll get people say, yeah, but that's such a great place where maybe we could put a stadium someday. And so you have almost like this Depression era mentality of never getting rid of something because you may use it someday. And what you end up with is there's an interesting, I'm probably more of a digital native than I should be at this point, but there's an interesting meme floating around amongst millennials inheriting their baby boomer parents' stuff. And if you have baby boomer parents, maybe this story will speak to you, is that maybe they have a china cabinet filled with collectibles, tender moments, china, china that they got from their family. And so I use these examples not because it really relates to people's lives. And I think, Andy Frisella calls them the asterisk holes, where they'll be like, well, actually, my parents don't have that, so it doesn't matter. Which I think totally. I think St. Louis is very guilty of as well. And I see this even in some of the feedback to what I post, which is, hey, these other places are doing really good and they're using models that seem to be working. And the comment might be something like, yeah, okay, but the Jefferson Arms is getting finished. I'm like, okay, but that's great, right? Nothing I say diminishes that.
Right.
But we can't claim credit today for something that started in 2017 that we've claimed credit for every year since then.
Well, I think when you look at global cities, and I'm going to expand the map here. We can talk about the domestic cities in particular: New York, LA, Chicago, even Seattle. I'll even throw Austin into the pile there. Because I spent 7 years. I lived in Chicago for 7 years post college. The fun years, a little bit of money, no kids. So we're really a lot of money, a lot of fun.
Yeah.
No kids.
Yeah.
And I quickly realized from that cultural, quote, what high school did you go to? The culture in Chicago is everybody accepts the fact that nobody in Chicago is from Chicago.
Ooh, I've got a good one for you.
And LA is a lot like that. When you get into the circles, of course there are people that were born and raised there, just as there are in Chicago. But that is not the brand.
So let me...
And here's where I'm going with this. Because the compare and contrast is, when you look at St. Louis, we are the extreme on the other end. Now, we talked earlier, 950,000 down to 275,000, whatever the number is. So I think part of it is this reality of decline in numbers. Mm-hmm. And you then, instead of like a Chicago in which the number is going the other direction, has been for 50 to 75 years, instead of like welcoming new, you are so afraid that you're going to lose all of your self-identity that starts to frame your opinion of development, of neighborhoods, of what should go in versus what should we save and what was.
I'll give you the example. I don't know if it's a economic or sociological or just kind of observational characteristic of different cultures. Cultures generally, you can broaden that out to global, religious, national, hyper local, whatever. Here's an interesting way I found to characterize that seems to ring true about how to characterize St. Louis, and just kind of, I think sometimes what we do, and in the conversations I've had around St. Louis, is that all of these ideas exist kind of in the ether, almost as like a big word salad and a cloud up in the sky. And I think sometimes what's useful, and this is tactic I learned in the graduate skills in dispute resolution and conflict management, is sometimes you gotta just pretend like you're holding this problem in your hand, or maybe it's in two hands, right? And just see if this feels right to you. So St. Louis, in culture, in style, in behavior, in attitudes, in a lot of ways is the westernmost East Coast city.
Totally.
Okay? And you think about this defined by two things. East Coast industrial city, and now we're in kind of a post-industrial city. Compare that then to Kansas City, the easternmost western, not West Coast, but western city.
Yes, it's a laggard. It's okay.
It's a little bit of a laggard, but but defined by. But what happens in these two things is how do we characterize these things? East Coast industrial city, close-knit, closed or cloistered cultures working around each other, right? And I think anybody who lives in St. Louis can kind of identify in their own orbit what are the closed or cloistered cultures that are interacting and rubbing up next to one another. And if you go back far enough in time, 100 years in St. Louis, you just look at the neighborhoods, right? Here, this is where the Irish lived. This is where the Germans lived. This is where the Polish lived. That's where the Italians lived. And that's a remnant of what you saw in old East Coast immigrant towns, Boston, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh. You don't get that in the West. Because once I don't know if you've ever driven between here and Colorado. My wife hates it when I do this, but whenever I drive,
Salina is halfway.
Whenever I drive, I've driven from Dallas to Southern California, from here to Colorado. Once you get out of Missouri, you realize like just how insane the proposition is to be on foot, walking into like the ether
sure.
of the great frontier. And I think you realize that takes a very different person. So the derogatory joke that I make in a hopeful spirit is that, the people who stayed in St. Louis, like if you played Oregon Trail, the people who got here in St. Louis, these are people who got halfway and stopped.
Let me ask you just a really remedial question based on your own personal experience, and then we're going to take a quick break and reset here.
Sure.
You grew up Southern California. We've established that. You went to Texas, which is a completely different world than California. You go to SMU, you finish it up, you meet the girl from here, you come back. When you came here, did you feel welcomed?
No. And I think when I talk to people, so I live in a subdivision, which I think enhances that, and we can get really meta on suburban expansion and what that's done to communities, neighborhoods, and otherwise. The answer is no, generally. And I think I would characterize that experience by my experience working at the regional chamber. It's the tone of that experience was, well, you're not from here, so what could you say? And even then, like I had done a lot of civic stuff in Dallas, and I was there at a really interesting time. Most people in St. Louis, when they think of Dallas today. They have no concept, not necessarily should they, no concept for what it looked like in 2000, 2004, 1995.
Oh, I watched the show. I remember the 70s.
Yeah, well, or maybe they saw that. Well, but see, 70s in Dallas was kind of a boom time. It was still in the middle of nowhere.
Big oil.
But the interesting thing that when I got to Dallas in 2004, because I was paying attention to all these real estate things, because of the way I grew up, I was aware of the fact that the city of Dallas had put $500 million in to try to make downtown a thing to no avail. Does that sound like a place that we might live in?
Right.
And it really, in my view, and I'm sure there's some other data and there's lots of other people who could probably give commentary on it, but it wasn't until the population pushed far enough out into North Texas that commuting to downtown or Plano, really where a lot of the headquarters went, became onerous, or you could not take DART, which is the metro there,
right,
that they started to backfill in, and then the uptown, downtown, Victory Park, that whole area exploded. And the other thing that happened there, when I first got there were very few kids from A&M, Texas, University of Texas, Texas Tech.
TCU.
TCU was a much smaller school at the time. And I mean, it was kind of the same size, but it didn't have the
population.
Population and the crosstown brand that maybe SMU did for making the city. That shifted after the recession. After the global financial crisis, that totally flipped, because Dallas, what Dallas had, people might not remember that the movie Office Space was meant to represent Las Colinas, Texas. And Las Colinas was kind of just like, back office space kind of places.
Well, here's what we're going to do. I need to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to finish up this Dallas analogy. And what I want to do is talk about downtown St. Louis.
Sure.
I want to talk about the city's role. I want to talk about Rams money. I want to talk about what heartbeat means versus development versus greater good.
Sure.
So we'll be right back after this.
All right.
Lucy.
Good. I love it.
All right, we're back. You were given a little bit of a
we were talking about Dallas.
Picture of Dallas. Dallas post crash.
So I sometimes try not to paint too much of a picture, because I don't think most people, if you said, hey, give the Dallas skyline some mental space. I think most people probably couldn't imagine that. But the important thing is twofold. One is that downtown Dallas and uptown Dallas was sort of it looks like this. We're sitting in Midtown. It looked kind of like this. If you go there today, you'd never know it. But if you were there, back when I first got there, you'd say, yeah, it kind of looks the same. And maybe there was some new construction. And obviously Texas has some other benefits and just cost benefits to labor and things like that. I'll tell you the story that has really kind of been bubbling up with me recently. When I first got to Dallas, there was a derogatory term known as the $30,000 millionaire. And, you might have kind of a smug college kid approach and be like, oh man, yeah, these 25-year-olds driving in their, brand new C-Class Mercedes, living in a luxury apartment, going out all the time. This is not the life I want to be living. Except then you get older and you think, okay, but maybe you don't like the person doing it just for whatever, judgmental cultural reason otherwise.
Right.
But the fact that they could do it is actually really important.
Right.
And I think if everybody, this is kind of dovetails into the critique of St. Louis, right? What's the pitch for St. Louis? It's a low cost of living, affordable place to raise a family, and objectively, it is not. Now, I say that with a caveat for the asterisk holes, right? If you make $100,000 and you live in a $125,000 house in St. Louis, or you bought it for $125,000, if you live in Tower Grove and you bought your house for $100,000 10 years ago, and you make $100,000, yeah, St. Louis seems pretty affordable. But if you look at the actual data and you look at the tax burdens and you look at the median income, you're not doing so hot.
Right.
And so when we start connecting some of the dots, right, and I think this is what we do in St. Louis a lot of times, is we'll point out something like, oh, St. Louis is so affordable because we have all these cheap houses, and so we show up at the top of the affordability list. Well, the answer is, if that was the case, and if that was going to move the needle, we've been at the top of the affordability list for a decade. Where are the people? And I think the best analogy I can give, because this blew my mind when I heard it. So do you know kind of the Dollar General or the dollar store business approach?
Well, as a shareholder, I know the shareholder value approach.
Yeah, okay. So,
but from a community perspective, I'll sit this one out.
Okay.
Continue.
So I always just kind of thought that the dollar store had stuff for $1 because it was cheaper, less expensive, or anything else. And this is not obviously part of my lived experience to be shopping on a budget at the dollar store. But the reason it blew my mind was because I don't think most people think of of the dollar store model as, their executive explained, he said, our customers can come in here with $10 and put 10 things in their basket, and they know that they're spending $10. This is the St. Louis approach. You can come here with $10 and you know that you're getting $10 of stuff. Here's the economics of that. The unit cost on each one of those $1 items is like 2 or 3 times what it would be if you bought it in like a regular store amount, right? So let's say I go to Costco and I get a 100-pack, and each one of those packages or those units is $1. Well, if you kind of scale that down to the dollar store size, they're actually $3 per unit. And I think that's really the way to think about St. Louis. And by thinking like that, the answers to the obstacles of what's going on here and why do we all feel so crazy, like we're trying all this stuff and nothing's happening, is that the product we're selling and the product marketing and the brand that we're promising, right? If we think of brand as the accumulated combined experiences we have with this product, it's the Buick. You remember the old, I just read about this. You remember the old Buick rebrand where they had the kind of all the different categories of people looking at the new Buicks and saying like, I can't believe that's a Buick. It's still a Buick and nobody bought them. And that's kind of what we try to do. The other thing that really distresses me in St. Louis too is that most of our advertising and branding is targeted at people who are here.
Right.
For example, I was watching the Super Bowl ads. I'm not saying we should do a Super Bowl ad, but we have this, all the news across the country is we have this housing affordability crisis. How much traction could we get with a simple video production? Go out to the nicest LRA properties and do a video and says, look, if you come to St. Louis, you can buy this. Here's what it'll cost, and you can have a house.
So here's
and then sorry, do it on YouTube for people watching house rehab videos.
Yeah,
right?
no, I mean it's so Jared. We were talking about him earlier.
Mm-hmm.
Jared Holst, right? Another LinkedIn active commentator.
Yeah.
St. Louis commentator. Really, usually on point as far as like how I view things as well. We were talking along the lines of exactly that from a real estate perspective. Okay, well, how do you entice individuals from other markets to want to come to St. Louis? Because when they Google St. Louis, they're going to be flooded with crime statistics. They're going to be flooded with, just the typical shit that we argue about around here. And some of it absolutely warranted and needs to be addressed. But we are not very good at the PR game. Mm-hmm. So he was joking. He's like, well, why wouldn't we just take a whole bunch of our gray stones and red bricks, et cetera, and, buy a bunch of, go into partnership with real estate agents and buy a bunch of billboards outside of Philly, outside of New York, et cetera, and just put pictures of these houses and put the price tag on there. Come to St. Louis, buy this house. Yeah. Simple as that. That's all you got to do. Like, here's our inventory, fully renovated, 4-bed, 2.5 bath. We're going to sell it to you for $300K.
There's some area, I read a lot of Jared's stuff and I'm usually in the comments somewhere, and there's 85% of the stuff we're right in sync, and that's one of them where, but then you have to step back and scratch your head and say, okay, but like, how is it that we can sort of like sit at a table without necessarily that background and come up with an idea that I think to 100 people, 90 of them would say that's so obvious, and yet we get these brand and advertising campaigns that I think most people scratch their head and say, what on earth are we doing? Like, what are we even saying here?
Well, a couple of years ago, there was a small group that we all got together, and it was a bunch of different kind of creatives and culinary individuals and pop culture individuals, et cetera. And this was pre-City SC, and there was a group of people that came in, and there's the team from the MLS came into town. And they all wanted to figure out MLS home office. The New Yorkers wanted to like get an idea as to, okay, what's the culture? Because MLS has a very strategic directive to make sure that new teams in particular are really leaning into the communities, the cities, the culture, the heartbeat of whatever makes said city itself. And in St. Louis, there was a group of us in there, and everything from, okay, what's the culinary treat from here, and of course everybody toasted ravioli, gooey butter cake, whatever. It's true. It's all true. We can lean into that. Sure. And then it got into pop culture. Like, what are people into? What's the most popular music here? Inevitably, everybody being in the city, they wanted to talk about R&B and soul and hip hop, and and I was the antagonist. I'm like, hold on, guys. I said, let's zoom out here. If you step on top of any bridge in this town, Kings Highway Bridge all the way to Poplar, look 20 miles in any direction, you're going to find farm fields. I'll tell you right now, Nielsen ratings tell me that 92.3 WIL and 93.7 The Bull are two country stations, and they are head and shoulders out in front of every other genre in our market. We are a country music town, whether you like it or not. And here's where I'm going with this. Like,
I have to interrupt because this is near and dear to my heart. I think so much of what we're experiencing here is really the conflict between three things, really. It's who we remember being, and that's sort of fading, right? So like glory the number days. Of the glory days. And you hear that when people say, well, we used to be the fourth largest city. Okay, who cares? It's been a really long time.
We hosted a World's Fair.
Zero, that is the feature, not the function. That's interesting, not engaging, right? And I think, so you have over here, it's sort of the glory days and nostalgia, which are important components of telling a story, particularly if you're talking one of rebirth and regrowth. The second part is like really an unwillingness to acknowledge like what actually is. And that's to your point. It's, we are a tier 3 or tier 4, depending on the metrics, regional city that is in decline. That is sort of shifting. But then on the third part, we're also like, where do we want to be? We want to be a blue city. We want to be all these other things, and there's the conflict in between that we can't reconcile.
Well, the conflict is really a simple matter of logistics and structure. Our biggest issue from a tier rating standpoint has nothing to do with what is really occurring down on Market Street and City Hall. Has everything to do with our bifurcation between St. Louis County and the city of St. Louis. Because when you look at other tier 2 cities that would realistically be our peer cities in that $1 to $1.5 to $2 million or 2 million population ranges, if you aggregate those numbers, GDP, crime, education, etc., we're top third in all the good ones.
You better reset that camera because here we go. I actually think, having participated in some of these debates and having had plenty of time to think about it, this is an issue that is both important, interesting, and also really it's an interesting thought process and engagement, and it's something to work on over time. But it's not the critical issue that you think. And let me use that by way of an example.
Well, hold on though. I'm going to push back just briefly. Sure. As someone that creates content and works with other individuals, and I work very closely with a lot of marketing agencies and brand agencies, at the end of the day, your widget is no better than than what your message and optics are.
Totally agree.
So when you have a city that is our peer, our singular peer, we do not have peers when people rate St. Louis as an option. Our peer is Baltimore. Mm-hmm. And it's purely because of the structure of the bifurcation between the county and city.
I want you to hold that idea in your hand, and I want you to turn it a few degrees. Remove initially the bias I know is coming about population. There are 88 municipalities in Los Angeles County.
Sure.
When you think of Hollywood, do you think Hollywood is its own municipality with its own set of guidelines and laws and everything else, or do you think it's part of Los Angeles?
No, it's all LA to me.
Yeah, and I think this is, but in reality, if you think about Los Angeles, a lot of the like Santa Monica, and Pacific Palisades, these are in Los Angeles County. They're parts of Los Angeles, but directly adjacent to that, like there are their own unique municipalities that contribute to it. So,
but there's one quick question, simple question, as it applies to LA. Does the policeman or the fireman from Santa Monica to Hollywoods to the Palisades to Topanga, do they wear different uniforms? The answer is they don't.
Well, in that case, because they're all city of Los Angeles. Now that gets into some structural pieces, right? So there are structural pieces like police, fire, building permits. Like I've talked to a couple of entrepreneurs who do like food trucks. Food trucks are a great example. Well, they've got to get inspections, permits, everything else. But here's the thing.
One more follow up.
Hold on though.
One more follow up.
No one from outside of St. Louis. No.
Hold on.
Wait a minute. Hold on.
If I'm a company that is growing in Omaha, Nebraska, because Papa Berkshire gave me startup money and I've scaled, and I need to go somewhere where I know I have population, right? Young population of programmers or whatever I need, right? And I have a team of consultants that are like, okay, let's create metrics. What are the metrics that we're going to look at in order for us to narrow down the cities that we want to go to? Yes. And if I put crime on, within the top 3, like, hey, I want to make sure I move. If I start a new company, I want all my employees to be safe, right? The statistics for the crime, if LA makes the list, is not going to be based on just Santa Monica. It's not going to be based on just Hollywood. It's going to be based on the macro county of LA proper. And that's the way it is with Chicago. That's why Cook County, everybody's like, oh, Chicago's so dangerous. Well, why the fuck does it never end up on anybody's bad list? Because it's part of Cook County.
I totally agree.
So we have to, in order to get into the conversation, you have to manipulate the numbers.
I also totally disagree, right? And here's why. Here's the explanation is, I think so much of the focus has gone to crime because it is important and it is highly derogatory. I was at a community meeting about this recent bill in Jeff City that was introduced to kind of force the merger of city and county. And there was a guy in there who did talent attraction.
Was this the one at Clayton the other day?
Yeah, it was great. It was a phenomenal experience, and it was so informative and reinforcing to a lot of the things that I think, and I'll get into kind of what that means.
I was going to bring a flask and just heckle.
It was actually a really great discussion. I actually really am proud of everybody who was there for participating and sharing. It was, I think there's a lot, what it's doing is it's raising a lot of questions that I think are important to consider. It is also highlighting the dysfunction, and I'll spin back around to that. So the crime is important, and the gentleman who stood up and talked about talent attraction, he said, when I'm trying to attract an executive to St. Louis, their wives have the internet, and the front page of the internet for St. Louis is crime stories. Now, that is...
Because they have statistics to back it up with.
Okay, well, that is more important to that person. However, you could not get a lot of... we try to get national attendance down to the landing. And because of the way their site selection worked, it's pulling in a lot of lower income population. There's just not enough density, right? I guess that's where I'm going with this. There's not enough density. So the crimes, you can't solve the crime stats. You got to solve the people problem.
No.
And there's a balance there. But let me ask you this: what would have to be true about a lot of things in order for those crime stats to move in a way that it starts to make a difference? And by that I mean, when you talk to the folks downtown, like on Wash Ave, the only solution they can come up with to crime is more police. More police, more police, more police. And this is sort of the circular thinking we get into. Let me give you an example of what they didn't consider. So during COVID, when we had all the street races, what we did at the landing is we said, okay, we have drug deals, murders, gunshots, people were shooting at barges, they're street racing down Lenore K. We're just going to go ahead and close that because we can't have these nice things for a while. So we'll just close that.
Because your insurance company called you and said
no. It was because I sat in a meeting with the Coast Guard, the casino, the Forest Service, the police department, the city, the landing, a whole bunch of people who all were like, yeah, when we get calls from the barge company, the people are shooting at us, we got to do something. So what we did is we said, okay, it's COVID, we're all not supposed to be out anyway. Why don't we just close the street? And so we kind of prevent that even from happening. Part of that cruising route at the time was coming down Wash Ave. So we went to the folks at Downtown Neighborhood Association and said, hey, there's a lot of other cities during COVID that are doing this very zany thing by creating pedestrian-only areas with outdoor seating. And you know what the response was? Well, but then how are we going to get drop-off traffic?
No, I know.
And so, I think that's the dichotomy of these things. You can't at the one hand insist that you can't bang your hand on the table and say, we've got to do something about crime. We got to get more police. All of these other things that lead only to basically having beat cops like it's the 20s in Brooklyn or something like that, and not be willing to do some other things that can change the environment in such a way that diminish the opportunity for crimes like street racing, all of these other things.
I agree fundamentally, and I think that, let me just qualify. Yes, I am pro-cop. Yes, I'm pro-cop reform from an investment perspective. I think they should be paid more, and I think they should be given more benefits to help them manage what they deal with. Okay, so that's my crime, asterisk, right?
Sure.
But you touched on something else too. When we come up with that hypothetical business, that company that is looking to potentially relocate here, as I mentioned, most of them hire these consulting firms that do the search for them, and they've got a number of metrics, and it's up to the company to say, what are the metrics that are most important? And you rate them 1 through 5. One of them is also median income. Sure. They're looking at the median income of the area. Here's another reality. As I stated earlier, with the crime statistics immediately take us out of being the worst to 38th or 44th or whatever the number is. The other number is the median income.
Sure.
When you take the city of St. Louis and you immediately start folding in Clayton and Town and Country and De Pere and Kirkwood, look, numbers all look better. And these are things we don't change structurally. One fucking thing. There is no new restaurant that's going to pop up because, oh my God, we're a city-county merger, right? All we're doing is taking data, inanimate data, and we're giving it lifeblood.
But I think there's... I think we're saying the same thing with a slight difference. So, for example, when we try to get national tenants to the landing, they weren't looking at MSA data. They weren't looking at citywide data. They were looking at within a radius of where they wanted to go, because they know, I'll make it up, for example,
Well, that's
like a yoga studio knows that they're going to get, 80% of their members from within a
walking distance,
5-mile radius or a 1-mile radius.
right?
So it doesn't really matter what the crime stats in North St. Louis or South City or Dutchtown are. If I'm looking at that, or half mile or whatever it is that like is just Botanical Heights in the Grove.
No, I totally get it. It's a waterway model. Look,
Yeah.
if there are enough cars driving by, eventually they're going to wash.
Exactly. Yeah. But I think what's happening though is we are so focused on these, and this is maybe more representative of a lot of my thinking, right? I think all of these issues are important. They're real. I'm not dismissing them. They are not invalid. But I think what happens is sometimes intellectually it's the NPR effect. We are making some of these issues so small and singular, or we are broadening them out so far that what ends up happening is we're telling a story that's distorted from what actually moves the needle. So how much more effort is it going to take to address a regional crime issue and implement a regional merger when by the way, we haven't even suggested an incremental approach to that. And that's what you really hear in the tension of those things. How much easier would it be to say, okay, here's what we need to do. We need to figure out, however these site selection groups are looking at the region, and we need to figure out some quarter-mile, half-mile, 1-mile radius places that we know they're looking, and focus on fixing those. Because then the next step is those areas will start to push out, and now we get some incremental growth because there are businesses that are willing to be a little bit more on the frontier.
Well,
they're just not going to go to the Wild West.
Let me try to dissect this a little bit so that we can consume it in more bite-sized portions here. I want to ask you your preference / thought as far as like target businesses that we would want to procure to move here to the city of St. Louis. The landing in particular is one that I think about, and obviously you're the perfect person to ask. Did you, or let me ask, which would you prefer? B2B style companies, given that you do not have density down there, you don't have, a large residential population. That
actually is currently incorrect. That was true before we did the rehabs, and the way that neighborhood is designed now is really apartments above, retail on the bottom.
How many units? How many people are we talking? Are we talking
I think
100, 200, 500?
So I think right now there are 175 completed units. I think by the time all of the properties are done, it'll be closer to right around 300. With then, obviously, there's other buildings to get done and that could be redeveloped as well. And going back to, I think so the point you're asking is what kind of businesses?
Because here's the thing, because we are so spaced out, because we have so many gaps in infrastructure, the business organizations or developers have to ask themselves and really do the dance and balance between, are we looking at more of a B2B approach in which we can bring in industry that where we can sell on margin, right? We can sell them on overhead acquisition. We can sell them on growth and logistics and all of those, traditionally black and white B2B check marks.
And you're talking about like economic development margin.
Yeah. So for example,
like the Amazon approach.
Would it make sense for a coal manufacturing company to come in? Because guess what? We've got barges. We have all that. Logistically, it's all there and the real estate's cheap, right? Or versus B2C, where consumer services, be it food and beverage or entertainment or shopping, what do you think is the low-hanging fruit given the landscape as it sits?
So I think about what you said a little bit differently. When St. Louis did their bid for Amazon, and these words are generally like in the pitch, we tried to sell on margin a bit. And the line that stuck out to me that just blew my mind, that I think kind of washed over a lot of people, was in describing the quality of life in St. Louis. The line was something to the effect of, hey, Amazon, if you relocate your employees here, you can pay them 85% of what you're paying them in Seattle, and they'll have a comparable comparable quality of life. And I said, well,
and they're going to produce for you at the same level.
and so it goes back. This is sort of, again, this is sort of how I think about these things. It's, if you look at these things in a vacuum, you end up with this distorted solution. But when you start to package them together and you say, okay, how do we solve crime and attract business? And oh, by the way, maybe we stop attracting people to St. Louis on an affordable quality of life, because all it's doing is a race to the bottom. We want to be in a position to do more with more. And I guess to your question about who fits here, the answer is twofold. It is not everybody. But I think most of what we're not doing in our economic development and our business attraction is we're really not leveraging our strengths. So what does St. Louis have like in spades? We have terrific trades and manufacturing talent. We have significant and frankly understated services for high net worth individuals, and particularly closely held private businesses. Now, what do we know about those businesses? They're not, you're not going to get a $10,000 or a 10,000 job move. But, if you can attract those family owned businesses and make, I don't know any other city that's taking this approach of closely held family businesses in the region. If you can attract them around the services, or you can even just, you don't want to have, in order for growth in St. Louis, you don't want to have an outsourced financialized economy, right? Interesting. I think what St. Louis has done over the years is the same thing that happens in small towns when they bring in a Walmart. So on the one hand, you get all this economic growth, service level economic growth. It creates jobs. But that money, the minute you spend that money at Walmart, outside of the wages that stay there and the property taxes, it just goes everywhere else. All the margin goes to Bentonville. And when you think about, again, the economy of a region, that might be okay because we're creating some jobs, and maybe it's in a place where there wouldn't otherwise be jobs.
Well, I think that there's a thin line there, and I'll give you a tale of two cities right here in our backyard, and then we're going to take a quick break. Kirkwood versus Webster Groves. Mm-hmm. Kirkwood was absolutely opened the door to big box. They have the big boxes from Depot, Lowe's. They have Target. They have Walmart. They have Sam's. They have all the who's who's, right? And what comes along with that is the tax revenue, and then you have all the the chain businesses that open up along those strips too. So they are killing it from a revenue perspective. Webster is a little bit more landlocked, but kind of took a little bit of the anti-big box approach, and it tends to run a thinner operating budget. So I see both sides of that. And I guess here's where I'm going with this. City of St. Louis is infamous for not liking chains. I'll point to our culinary world in particular. You find me a chain restaurant in the city of St. Louis that isn't fast food, I'll show you one that's closed in 18 months. That's usually how it goes. Sure. Here. We are very close-minded when it comes to those kinds of things. So therefore, here's my quick question. On the landing, back to the original point. Yeah. Industry or consumer staples, which do you think works best there?
Neighborhood staples. So when I think of St. Louis, on the micro level, right? So on the macro level, I think what we've done is that Walmart effect. On the macro level, that's conceptual macro, because we, think about all the treasured companies in St. Louis. What's happened? They got acquired. Yep. The headquarters got moved, and so all of that kind of like excess resources that these privately held companies typically generate, because they're more generous with companies that used to kind of diffuse around the community. Well, that's all gone. Yep. And now it's all corporate, public company. We got to take a break.
Quick break. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, downtown Rams money, mayor's race.
A little bit more.
Here we go. Okay, we're back.
So we're talking about retail, and I think the hard part to me is when I start to think about real estate development, regional growth, economic development, all these things. It goes back to that tapestry of history that I was talking about, and I think so often we get caught in the facts. The fact of we have these crime stats, or we don't like chain stores. That's fine so long as then we understand, well, okay, what does the alternative look like? And so what will work at the landing is different than what will work in Tower Grove, which is different than what will work in one of the small municipalities in North County, which is different than what's going to work in Chesterfield, which is different than what's going to work in Wildwood. And there may be some overlap, but as an example, the people who live in those neighborhoods are different. So we're in Midtown. Do you have a lot of young families living in Midtown? No, you have a lot of college students.
Well, there's none.
Well, yeah.
So here's the deal. This is a seemingly insurmountable solution. Because again, if we just take the mathematics of the landing, you just talked about when the project is done, at least this phase, you're talking about 200 units. How many units did you say?
I think by the time everything's finished out, well, again, two parts of that equation. So you're talking about 300 units, but I think the daytime population down there is close to like 3,000 people.
No, I understand that,
Yeah.
but we're still talking about macro numbers. So if we talk about 300 units, let's aggressively say that there's 3 people per couple and a kid. We're talking 900 people. And you add that into the larger number that we were addressing earlier, the gross population. If we start looking at how do we regroup, how do we shift the tide, that's not the solution. And here's where I'm going with this. We need to think bigger, and this is where I want to shift the conversation.
Sure.
I want to get into the city, the ARPA money, the Rams money, the standoff, because we need bigger ideas. I want to get past.
Yeah. Let's push back on that micro a little bit because I think I'll give you the example. So when I was out in Herman, one of the properties that I bought came with like a little restaurant. It was kind of a 12-seat restaurant, and so during that time, I ended up being the chef, the host, the waiter, the innkeeper, the everything. And that was really informative to really the changing nature of retail and restaurant businesses. And again, this is a anecdote of one, and I'm painting with a broad picture. But here's a couple things that I think are useful to think about. And I'll balance this with during the time I went to Japan and I went to Tokyo and Osaka, and I kind of saw what's different about the retail there. And obviously there's an ocean of cultural difference between the two and the density and everything else.
Literally.
But that I think so often in St. Louis, I've been jumping around a little bit. Philosophically in St. Louis, and I felt this for a long time, and tell me if this is true with you. I think so often we set the table for figuring out solutions or finding insights where we just got done with the Super Bowl, and it's sort of like we wait until like the last half of the fourth quarter when we're down by 40 to try to start scoring touchdowns, and then we kind of think, of course we were going to lose. The baseball example is, this is a town that sort of piles things up into such a huge problem that we're at the bottom of the ninth, the last game of the World Series, bases loaded for a grand slam home run, and that's the only way we can win. And then when we get struck out, we just sort of say, things haven't been the same here since the Chrysler plant left. And I think that's sort of the defeatist. It's the defeatist way of approaching things that has been self-reinforcing. And I think it goes to your big ideas, is sometimes it's important to zoom in and say, okay, at the landing, that retail is going to be different than what works at the Foundry, which is going to be different than what works on Wash Ave, which is going to be different. So I live in Wildwood and Chesterfield. So we have an interesting, outside of the city perspective here. You have Chesterfield, which is stucco and strip malls. Right. And then you have Wildwood, which has this town center that it's there, but it's not booming. And what do we make of that? Are we to make of that the people in Wildwood don't want to go there? Or, and so what is it about the dynamic of the community? Is it a chicken or the egg, or is it both? And I think so often it's both, but we try to figure out, we let the perfect get in the way of the good. And so to your point about thinking about like big ideas, right?
Well, let me point something out, though. You were talking about earlier where the daytime population on the landing is really closer to 3,000 as opposed to the 300 potential residents, right? I always think back to an economic project we did in college, in which we were comparing and contrasting the racetrack in Illinois to the Jones Dome before the Rams came the first time. And long story short, what we realized was if there were only 4 major races a year at the racetrack, a NASCAR truck, and then 2 regional races, versus 1 preseason game, 8 home games, and 1 playoff game, the 4 races at Gateway were more of an impact to the MSA than 10 Rams games at the Jones Dome. And the reason was really quite simple. The numbers proved that the NASCAR, the racing fan, is a mobile fan. They are going to be coming in from an average of anywhere from 250 to 500 miles. They will drive to see their favorite racer and spend the money within the marketplace. You see where I'm going with this?
A little bit.
When I think of the landing, that short of the arch and the people that are coming to the arch, which most of those people, the tourists are there for the arch. We're really talking about decapitated dollars from other portions, whether it's somebody in Wildwood driving down to, I remember the old spaghetti factory when I was a kid, or whatever, right?
Sure.
We're talking about the same dollars. So here's where I'm going with, I want to get to bigger picture.
Yeah.
I'm going to start with the mayoral candidates and tie this into our conversation. There are 4 people that are on the ballot, 3 Democrats, 1 Republican, which I know a lot of people are listening like, there's a Republican in St. Louis? Yeah, there is. There's one. The 3 Democrats are Tashara, the incumbent, Kara, who is far out and away in the lead right now, and then Michael Butler, who is current recorder of deeds, city employee. Then there's Andrew Jones, who is the Republican. African-American man, Republican, on the ballot as well. The three Democratic candidates, which are realistically the only 3, viable in the race, they are fighting. It's a race for them each to argue who is going to be better at filling potholes and picking up trash. Nowhere, because I follow all 3. There's not a conversation being had in regards to development, growth, jobs. Maybe a little bit on the Kara Spencer side, simply because Bob Clark's tossed his hat into the ring.
Sure.
Clayco, for those of you wondering. And here's where I'm going with this. How are we as a region? How is the business community? How is the development community? How is Greater St. Louis, Inc.? How are third-party companies in other markets that are looking for great deals all over the country with phenomenal real estate to grow and develop? How are any of them going to thrive if the city's leadership appears to be ignoring development questions? That's my one capital A. My one lowercase a is, what do you see the role of City Hall in working with individuals like yourself on the project and the landing and trying to procure these businesses to develop within the city of St. Louis?
There's a lot to unpack there.
Yeah, I know.
So
I do that on purpose.
I think the important place to start, and again, broad brush, anecdotal, but when I zoom out, I think it's hard in St. Louis, and it's true in our own lives. We always like to think that other people are thinking of us all the time. And it's very unsettling to think that other people are not consumed with what we're doing at any given time. When I zoom out, we were in Denver and we told people we were from St. Louis and they're like, I don't know where that is. And I think that's a good place to start because no one in the U.S. has really cared about St. Louis in a positive way since the Cardinals were since Mark McGwire was hitting home runs and Nelly was putting out hits. Like, no one cares about gooey butter cake. No one cares about toasted ravs. No one cares about Provel cheese, except when BuzzFeed compares it to whatever they do.
Or John Hamm, who is a traitor.
And who cares? If Andy Cohen, John Hamm, and
Sterling K. Brown,
any of these folks, if anybody cared and thought, because here's the dynamic, right? When was the last time you heard a story from anybody like you hear about going to Hollywood? I grew up in a cornfield in Iowa, and I knew that to make it, I had to be in Hollywood, and I had to pick up and go. And I say that not as a disparagement to St. Louis, because I am irrationally hopeful at the assets that we have here and our ability to capitalize on them.
So I don't want to meander here. I want to get back to
yeah.
specifically the mayoral question so that we can stay on point a little bit.
I understand, but
connect the dots between City Hall and maybe your projects in particular. Copacetic, helpful, not helpful? Were you on an island? Because we can extrapolate that out into the greater region.
I think so. My initial example is important because anything that whoever wins the mayoral race does is the baseline is where it is. I don't know that it can get like horrifically worse, and that's not an indictment on the current or former mayor or anything else. It's what the city has to work with is what it is, and I think the more national and local commentary is that we put so much hope and onus on, St. Louis is very, I'm going to say paternal place, but I say that in the sense of there's a lot of people who are happy to go about their daily lives and say, wow, somebody should really do something about this. And then they go back to their daily lives and they're concerned about it. Somebody should really invest in that thing. But when's the last time they signed a guarantee? And so I say that in the sense that there's this hope that the mayor will do something, or that Greater St. Louis will do something, or that somebody else will do something. Here's my experience. When we first started buying properties at the Landing, you know what people told us?
Did they ask, are you opening Mississippi Nights again?
That was number one.
Yeah.
And it was,
and then
my first job was at Spaghetti Factory.
Yeah.
But it really was good luck to you. And I say this by the example of, anybody in St. Louis that throws out, we're the show me state. Here's what I know about that person is that they are not going to be there to support me up front. I know that they will probably do something to obstruct whatever I'm doing. I know that they will probably in the ether say, gee, I don't know. Are these guys do they really know what they're doing? And I don't know if, I wouldn't have done it that way, but then I guarantee you they'll be there for the picture. And then they'll say, oh yeah, we were here all along. And then you say, well, hey, when it was really hard, where were you? When we needed help, where were you? And I say that because that represents my experience in the city, with the city government and in the city. There are some tremendous people within St. Louis Development Corporation. I think some of the, I've been paying a lot more attention to the Board of Aldermen meetings.
When they get off or when they go off on schedule?
We've had some interesting ones the last few weeks, but so, Deanna Velasquez put forth a bill to appoint a city administrator. I think that was the language they came up with. I couldn't be more supportive of that. Now, I'm not a city voter. I live in Wildwood, but that'll impact me directly because you know what's going to happen? Because right now you get back into this, okay, you have a crime problem, that's the front page. Well, you know what the front page is right now? It's potholes and ice and streets. When you professionalize the management of a city and you let the politics be politics, this is terrific. The comptroller of the currency, Mrs. Green, I heard an interview with her with Sarah Fensky. It was amazing. I mean, we have terrific leaders in the city who understand, I guess what gets me so animated about all of this is that on the one hand, the mayor can only do so much. The alderman can do so much. SLDC can only do so much. We are limited by our vision and our ability to have big ideas.
Okay, so let's say
that create systems, but at the same time.
But we're kind of, and this is no offense to our conversation, but we are kind of going in the same circles that all of them run in. There's $1 billion roughly that is available between ARPA and RAMS money. $250 million is allocated to you, Dave. What are you spending it on? Because this is the thing.
Yeah. Okay. So
it's not that we don't have means.
Sure.
It's not that we don't have land. It's not that we don't have inventory or infrastructure or cash at this point. We have all of that. They are not doing anything. What would you do?
I think there's a couple things. So and I'm going to answer your question. We are doing some of the right things, but so slowly as that they don't make a difference. And I'll give you an example of that. So I was reading an article, I think Neil Richardson at SLDC was talking about how they were using ARPA money to tear down the vacant buildings that could not be salvaged. And great headline. And they had done, I think it was like 300 over the last couple years. And their goal is to do 1,000 and to have that done by the end of this year. And so that is the right thing. You know, if you asked me 3 years ago, like what is one of the most impactful things you could do to bring development and prosperity to the region and impact crime, poverty?
Yeah, clean up lots.
Clean it up. Just, you know, take a minute, clean up the whole place,
Right.
take down the vacant buildings, you know, do something interesting with the vacant lots that doesn't require forestry to mow them every week, right? That's kind of another allocation of resources. That's number one. And do it fast and visibly. I think, you know, going back to my example of that bottom of the ninth home run, I think so much of what we do is we think there's going to be a moon shop. Like there's going to be a moon shop. There's going to be a stadium. There's going to be a new convention center. There's going to be something that, you know, like if only we could do this one thing, it'll help. And in the meantime, there's 1,000 other little things that would make a difference in the lives of everybody. And I want to be very specific as I think about these ideas. You know, when I get angry about these things, like this righteous indignation, every time we don't do something like clean out the vacants, it is making the problem more intractable and it is harming people. And as an example, the longer we allow North St. Louis, north of Wash Ave, to languish and deteriorate, it's going to cost us way more money to help those neighborhoods rebuild. That is also harming every St. Louis public school student who attends those schools just because of the way we fund our schools.
Sure.
And so it you know, on the one hand, we can't say, well, we wish our schools were better and we wish that we could have safer neighborhoods and we wish that we could have all this growth, but then try to solve that through a stadium.
So let me come full circle
Yeah.
then. $250 million, what are you spending it on?
I'm going to plead ignorance to some of these costs. So just give me enough rope to hand myself there. So the first thing I'm doing is I'm cleaning up every single vacant property, like to the max. And that means you use your minority women business owners, you use contractors, like that's just priority one. So the next 6 months or the next 8 months, we're going to clean up all those deteriorated buildings. We're going to reclaim the materials because then we build into that a program for job training for, you know, one piece is clean up the buildings. The second piece is take those materials and use that as part of our workforce training efforts. So take a piece of that money too, set up something like, you know, call it like the Casserly School for Building Arts, right? So just kind of honor Bob Casserly and what he used to do with preserving all of that architecture, and teach kids how to make value-added products with either the reclaimed materials or use them in new buildings. That's a full circle, right? That's a sustainable system that we can create for that piece. Number two is I'm going to start reimagining some of the areas downtown. And that might mean I'm making Wash Ave pedestrian only on the north-south sections between the major areas and see what that does. So we can do 1,000 experiments, take 10 million of that, do 1,000 experiments, figure out where we can do those in different areas, where it's appropriate. I think then I'd take, let's say you have $200 million left. I would probably take $100 million of that, and I would draw a circle around Dutchtown, Benton Park, Cherokee Street, kind of that nexus, and I would funnel that into whatever system there that is going to allow that area to start being a draw and be self-sustaining. And if that takes $20 million, great, but they have $100 million there. I'm going to do low interest guaranteed loans. I'm going to figure out a program. You know, one of the problems we have in mixed use right now is that the cap rates between the retail and the apartments are so different that we can't, you know, St. Louis, because there's not enough demand, we can't charge enough rents in the commercial space.
Which brings me to the follow-up based on your last answer. I will play a little word association here.
Sure.
It's one of my favorite words. It actually really super annoys me, but inevitably, based on your suggestion and ideas, this would come up. How do you address our progressive wing and gentrification when you do start to develop neighborhoods that are downtrodden?
I push back with a question, which is, what are we talking about?
No, here's the thing. I hate the term. Well, but it's so misunderstood, and it's so overused. But that would be, from a political standpoint, you want to go toe-to-toe with the Board of Aldermen?
Absolutely.
You start improving a neighborhood. God forbid you do that, because you're going to be the evil gentrifier.
So, and I've experienced some of that pushback, and I want to really, I think this is a really critical point in our region, is our inability to have some of these conversations. So we didn't get to it before, but so I did my master's in dispute resolution and conflict management. I'm a true millennial. I did a liberal arts undergrad, and then I went and did a liberal arts master's degree. But what was so interesting about that is it changed the way I thought both about history and about the world around me, because there are people who you'll meet in the conflict management space who are extremely empathetic and feelings based, right? And these are people who feel the pain of others very deeply. I'm not quite on that level, right? I can empathize, and I think I look at it as, what are the systems around us? And I don't want to get caught up in the systemic stigma that I think we've created recently, but like, what are the systems that are causing these things? And I'll highlight that saying two things. So I had a professor who profoundly changed my life when he said, the tiniest bit of evil, right? So like the origin of evil, the tiniest bit of evil is the inability to see even a fraction of yourself in the other person. And I think so long as we can start a conversation about equitable development, gentrification or otherwise, with the understanding that I see you, I hear you. I didn't grow up here. And this is kind of my story here. I didn't grow up here. I don't know what it's like to live in a house like this. I don't know what it's like to have the water turned off, the heat turned off, the roof falling in over me. But I've been scared before. I've been fearful quite recently of losing quite everything I have. And I can start there, and I can maybe start to hear you when somebody like, whether somebody who looks like me or talks like me or who is just frankly totally different comes into your community and says, hey, the things that are happening here may not be great.
I get it, but what we're really talking about, I mean, this is the macro problem in our politics nationally, in so much that there's a difference between understanding, and there's a difference between having empathy and then wanting other people to have empathy, and then the reality of economic markets and the reality of activations and the reality of, for example, when you start to talk about having, spent 15 years renovating historic buildings, I can tell you right now, if I have to touch another Soulard brick or a true nominal piece of lumber or a plaster wall, I'm going to punch myself in the face repeatedly.
Three questions for you.
No, I won't do it again.
So I remember, I always try to draw from some of like the maligned pop culture phrases, right? So I can remember listening to talk radio in like 08, 09. And it was right around when Obama got elected. And there, I don't remember what the context was, but it was sort of like hey, you will be made to care about these issues. And maybe it was 2012, something like that. And it was really sort of like the national Democrat message being directed towards Republicans. And that's some of the tension, right? And so, I always look at conflict as like the sound that systems make when they're rubbing against each other. And that could be a conflict of, intellectual systems or structural systems or political systems or whatever it is. And I think so much of that, and I think about kind of our St. Louis now, right? How important is it that I understand? And by understand, that means I have lived it, I have experienced it, I have grown up in it. Like I understand, versus I am empathetic to this because you and I have both experienced fear in a similar context. And so we can have a conversation about that. And is it okay that maybe it's different and that we can have empathy for one another, but I don't have to like understand that lived experience?
No, I understand that, but at the end of the day, I mean, it goes back to who is it? Plato, right? Poverty is the father of all crime. Or Aristotle, one of the two. I don't know. Anyway, my point is, like, we can sit around and conceptualize how we are going to emotionally approach these issues, quote, solutions, and integrate themes and wish lists such as, understanding and empathy and everything else. At the end of the day, the underwriters don't give a fuck.
Totally don't care.
Call a spade a spade. They don't care. And therefore, if we can figure out a way to harness or shift empathy or sorrow or pity, because that's really what it is. I mean, we're kind of being degrading in the sense that it's really pity. It's not empathy, because we look at these areas as developers, and I'm guilty, raising my hand. I looked at how can I make money. Now, if all those other good things happened, great, because to my core, I'm a good person. And if I was crossing a line, I would stop. But the vast majority of developers, when they see the line, if they see more dollars, they cross that line.
Yeah. So this is a great foil for a lot of things in St. Louis, and I'll give you the example. So I think the coming out of the pandemic, I think one of the things I recognized was, and you asked me before, like, why do I develop these buildings? One is because I love them. I love the buildings. And so, I'm not a bleeding heart preservationist, and I don't begrudge anybody modernizing these buildings. And, it's a contradiction. And I think sometimes you have the other side, which is the hardcore developer, which is I'm going to chase every single last dollar because that's what I'm geared toward. Sure. And I see this extractive perception here. And that's fine too, and you need that because you can't, if it was true that simply caring about blight and declining neighborhoods would lead to prosperity, then we would not have the different areas of decline in the city that we do. So I think for me, and I think this goes back to a lot of stuff that I hope I'm communicating when I write on LinkedIn, is I want to understand the issue at hand. But I also want to maybe consider that there are some things and some questions that we can ask a little differently. And so the example there is I've thought a lot about this. So if it is true that the major objection to gentrification is we will lose our community or our sense of community from the people who have stayed here and who are here, right? And we don't want somebody from outside of our community coming in and telling us how to live. And I think...
Or displace.
Or just, well, that's the second point. And I am worried about displacement because, and the because is generally one of a couple things. It's usually, I've heard in the conversations, it's usually, well, our property taxes are going to go up so much that we won't be able to afford the place because, so-and-so who lives there is on a fixed income, and so we just can't afford it. Something like that. And I think to myself, okay, if that is true, right? If the problem is we need to take a little bit more of a community approach, and we need to figure out how to keep the property taxes the same, these are very simple problems, right? If it's a property tax issue and a displacement issue, okay, fine. Can we create our own special gentrification district that freezes property taxes and then create some incentive for new construction so we can actually maintain these places and address those issues? And I think sometimes what happens there is, and this is sort of my take, is if that's the problem, let's solve that problem. And if there's something else, then we need to be honest about it. And I think what happens so much in this conversation about like gentrification or these other pieces is either people have gone into it and saying, I'm going to come, you know what's wrong? Your neighborhood is falling apart and I'm going to come in and fix it. And you have this like, whether it's I'm from the government and I'm here to help, or I'm from the county and I'm here to help, or, I'm a rich old white guy and I got money to come into these disadvantaged neighborhoods. I think that's the entry point matters to a point. And this is where I look on the other side, which is, okay, but you know what? When the guy who works at a nonprofit, or when the person who works at a nonprofit is sitting there finger wagging at you about all of the things that you could never understand about what it is to be here and how much you should care about it, there's a certain extent where, as a developer, you say, okay, I get it. Let me be considerate of this. And then there's a point where you say, you know what? I don't care. And that's...
Yeah, no, to your point, I mean, what you're talking about is simply that when you do go into those community meetings and somebody's telling you that you don't understand, it's like, no. Here's the deal. What I understand to be true is that your people can't afford what I'm proposing. So instead of us trying to talk about how do we close this gap, how do we create opportunities for equity, how do we create partnerships in which we can start to create equity? Because really, what you're saying is you want the status quo. You actually do not want your people to improve because you see me as purely as a displacement vehicle. And that's, in my experience, whether it's Old North St. Louis or Tower Grove or Lafayette, because I've been in all of them.
Yeah.
That's what they talk about.
Sure.
It's never, okay, those are cool. Your price points are scary. Nobody here can afford it. But, how is that going to benefit us? Like, let's just ask simple questions.
Right.
It's always displacement.
And I think, and so that's where I think you're getting to my point. And I hear two things in that, and I hear it in your frustration. I hope you hear it in like my frustration for this.
Well, that's why I'm out of the business. I
So-
left it because of that.
All right, so I'm gonna go on a three for here. So have you seen There Will Be Blood with Daniel Day-Lewis?
Yeah, absolutely. Multiple times.
So there's one of my favorite scenes that most recently has kept coming up. Everybody gets really excited about I drink your milkshake. The scene that stuck with me forever, outside of the opening scene, is when that first, I think it's the Coyote Hills discovery, where he's sitting in the house with all the people in the community, and they're all yelling at each other, and they're all arguing about how they're, who's going to get the money, how are they going to do this,
Who's going to cut it up?
who's going to do whatever, and because you're in this house, you can just see him sitting there listening, and he stands up and he walks out, and there's a guy that chases him and says, Mr. Plainview, where are you going? We need you. And he says, no, thank you. No, thank you. And by the way, in the rest of the scene, you see people hooting and hollering, jumping and dancing as the oil streams in the road, right? It's just flowing from the ground. And he turns around and he says, I wouldn't take it if you gave it to me as a gift. And I think that's how so many people in St. Louis feel. I felt it when I come in from the outside. It's like, hey, you know what? I came in here with good intentions, a willingness to listen, capital, resources. And you know what happened? The longer I was here, the more I felt like Daniel Plainview. I said, you know what? I wouldn't give it to you if you gave it to me. I wouldn't take it if you gave it to me for a gift, because you've made it so miserable and so hard, not from people who I respect and who have a valid opinion, but from people who are just like, either they're operating on grant money, and so it's come in and they're working for it, but like they're not signing the guarantee.
Yeah, it's so annoying. Like there's just no creative mindset anymore. I'll give you an example. You tell me what you think of my idea. So what I thought would be creative and simple and non-judgmental was to take a simple little, $25-30 million chunk of all this money. We're talking, pennies. Based on the full amount, put it in a holding account. Go to your designated neighborhoods from Dutchtown through to Bent Park West, through to North Side, etc., and say, okay, any of you individuals that are in this area, if you're going to buy a house and you don't have the full 20% and you're subject to points, we're going to have a points program, right? You come to us, show us the address, show us your income, your tax, and what we'll do, we'll give you a grant to buy the points, to get you to the 20% threshold, so that extra 1, 2, 2.5 points that are added to your interest rate, which is the number that really kills you as a mortgage payer.
Sure.
Like, we are going to help you create equity, because that's what none of these politicians have laid out strategies to generate wealth. And wealth is when people hear wealth, they think of yachts. That's not what wealth is. Wealth is the gap between what you have and what you need to spend.
Let me give you a couple insights on that too, because you raise up a few other points. And so before I lose it, I want to give an example too. We're talking a lot about the city, right? And it's very city centric, and that's fine. That's I think where we are, right?
Well, because of the county, the county's ruined by boomers. Well, we don't need to talk about the county.
I want to tell you a story about being in Herman, if that's okay.
That's a whole other beast,
right? But it's the same. You'll hear the same attitude, and I think it goes to the sort of like unspoken and unreasonable expectations. So here we are in Herman and St. Louis and Missouri, and we're talking about affordable housing. There's not enough affordable housing. Now, what happened in Herman was that up to 2019, you could get a reasonable house there. These kind of like 2-3 bedroom, 1-2 bathroom houses, $145,000, kind of similar to a lot of places in St. Louis. Well, COVID hits, Airbnbs come in, and the prices like double. Now they doubled kind of everywhere. The other thing that happened in Herman is you had some influx of population, and something else happened too. And it's sort of this micro gentrification there, which was a lot of these houses were like falling apart. But for COVID creating an economic incentive to invest significant dollars, a lot of these buildings probably would have fallen down. So now these buildings are all expensive. And out there's a little old school building. And I looked at it and I said, okay, well, like we're doing these cool school conversions here in St. Louis. I wonder what it would look like out there. And I said, you got some pretty interesting incentives for affordable housing, in that, not in the low income strata, but
Section 8, yeah.
And 60 to 80% AMI, and there's a lot of seniors out here. Like, I wonder what that would look like. And there's a lot of demand, right? You're kind of hearing in the ether, there's no affordable housing in St. Louis. Or in Hermit. We need more affordable housing. And so finally I got to a point where I was like, okay, I'll investigate this. And so there's a little Facebook group, and I posted on the Facebook group. I said, okay, so I've heard a lot of you say that we need more affordable housing. Like, when you say affordable housing, like, what do you mean? Like, what do you actually mean by that?
I can tell you what they were thinking.
What were they thinking?
Not those people.
Oh, no.
Because
that was part of it. They didn't want low income. But here's the other piece is their expectation of affordable housing was, well, I used to be able to rent a full house for $400 a month plus utilities.
Yeah.
And in that, when you say affordable housing or we don't have affordable housing, I think a lot of people use this as a catchphrase. And it's the same thing when we talk about an affordability crisis, or we talk about generational equity. And it leads me to my other point, which is, this was bothering me so much because I was like, what is it about like these equity plans that just don't seem to make sense? And to your point, is I think a lot of time we think like, oh, all these rich people are passing along generational equity, and everybody's got all this generational equity. The average inheritance in the U.S. is like $45,000.
Right.
And so, okay. And I would push back on your proposal because it's a little complex. And I'm not saying it's so complex that people can't understand it, but I think all of these plans in St. Louis get so complex, and and this is sort of my experience working in St. Louis. Okay, you want to get incentives. Well, you got to get the buy-in of the aldermen. Then you got to go to SLDC. Then SLDC has to do a board bill. And so you got to get all the aldermen on there. And so you've kind of got this ecosystem where, and I think even Jared has proposed some of these things where it's like, look, just have some automatic incentives here. Hey, if you do A, B, and C, your incentive is there. That's the program for this area. Go nuts.
Well, for example, okay, 20 million, the math is pretty simple. You take the average house around, within these districts that I'm talking about, they're in that $125,000 to $175,000 range, right? 20 million divided by a $20,000 or $2,000 grant per house, because that's roughly the point. In order to buy your points down, it's going to be on average about $2,000 per purchase.
How does this land with you? So,
but that number, that's not rocket science. That's 10,000 home purchases in which you are reducing the mortgage rate from a 8.5 to a 7 in today's market. That's a big fucking difference when you amortize that out over 5, 10, 20, 30, let alone the full life.
But does it so to go full circle here. So when I was in Dallas, there was the Habitat for Humanity there did a program, and I just looked at it, and I can't remember what they called it. It was not Grow South. That was Dallas's big kind of program. But they raised $100 million. Now this, Dallas bigger scale, but they raised $100 million, and that became a revolving loan fund. And the Habitat for Humanity program is they would rehab houses and they would build new houses, and they would and I think at the time it was, then you get a 0% interest rate if you're a Habitat family. Why can't we do that here? And maybe it's not 0%, but what if it was 3%? Target the area, and don't even worry about target areas and say, look, if you're going to buy a house in this defined geography, we have a St. Louis loan program, which is underwritten by some local bank that wants to do it for free, and it's going to be serviced by a local bank that's, whatever. We're going to hold the loans. You're going to pay 4% interest, but you got to move there. And by the way, you got to live there for 5 years.
Yeah. I'm with you. At the end of the day, what we're talking about goes to my point earlier. What we are now talking about is actual logistic chess in how that you can mobilize and create home ownership, equity, affordable housing, whether it's rent or own. And the thing is, I'm going to go back to the mayoral discussion. None of them have a plan. Nobody on the Board of Aldermen is talking about how you're going to economically actually improve these. They are looking at ways to just simply kill abatement. And abatement to me, is skin in the game. And
Yeah.
that's not a dirty word.
So I think there's another factor here. So I go back, every time I come back to any of these city issues or any of the, why, anything where you're saying like, well, why can't we, right? Why not? Why not St. Louis? Why can't we? Why can't we do this? I come back to this idea of we are solving problems in a way that is not addressing like accurate issues. So for example, when we talk about the regional median income, for families, it's $54,000. For individuals, it's $35,000.
Yep.
When we talk about affordability, so even using the example, okay, so let's say I could buy a house that was in decent shape in North St. Louis, and I was in that median family income of $54,000. When we look at the affordability, there was a recent, like St. Louis is one of the most affordable metros. Well, you know what it said? In order for this to be affordable, your household income had to be $77,000. So already we're underwater at the median level. Then when you start, then that is on your gross income. So $70,000 gross income. Then when you start calculating in the tax burden of being in Missouri. So what bothers me so much about the city and the county and it's all these places that portend to be progressive, they are creating systems that are extremely regressive. Right?
Yeah.
Let me ask you a question.
So if I
have a $5,000 car and I don't know.
I know
like,
where you're
hey,
going.
I'm buying that car. If I'm keeping that car for 10 years, I've bought it 3 times. And by the way, I paid the sales tax on it. I understand, like, there's a resistance to, I'm always very in favor of more realist, like more property, like real property tax. If you really wanted to turbocharge St. Louis, I did the math. And I probably did it wrong, but I did the math. And I think if you added $13 per, however they measure it, like $13 per thousand or $13 per hundred
on the property tax.
On the property taxes.
Yeah.
You could completely replace the net earnings tax, the payroll tax, the earnings tax, and the personal property tax. Now, it sounds extreme, but guess who it doesn't penalize anybody, but you know what it does? Now
those are all regressive taxes.
They're all regressive, and guess what? I think of the same thing as I was talking to a friend who lives in Clayton, who was very supportive of the Missouri gas tax, and their perspective was, well, I live in Clayton and I drive 10 miles to work or something like that, so like a little gas tax, no big deal. And I said, okay, so let me give you the rural perspective. For work, because I have cattle or I farm, I've got a car that in the city would be a gas guzzler, and I'm towing things, so I get 10 miles a gallon. What you've done is taken my biggest expense and expanded it by 5 or a few percentile. And I think when we talk about in Missouri, at Jeff City, a lot of the things that happen to St. Louis, where we sit here and we say, oh, well, St. Louis creates all of this GDP for the state, so these people in Jeff City don't know anything. Well, the problem is, and I think there's no self-reflection here to say, the reason why in Jeff City they're proposing bills to force a merger, take control of the police, anything else that people here get kind of tense about, it's because their perspective is, I don't know what's going on in St. Louis. That place seems like the Wild West to me, and I don't see them handling their business, and the data reflects it.
Well, no, only on crime. Because you can look at job growth, you can look at GDP, you can look at wage growth. Because there's 114 counties.
Let me ask you a question. If all the poor, so the demographics are showing, our biggest population loss is lower income African American families.
I am not
if
a
lower income African American families leave
apologist at all. What I am never going to allow though is for MOLEG, the likes of the Ben Bakers down in rural Joplin.
Sure.
Right, these guys that are coming in, that none of them have a degree in economics. None of them have ever worked in urban environments, but they're really good on Twitter. I am not going to take their word that St. Louis really doesn't have its shit together. There are problems, but I would much rather have the problems that we have here than the absolute stagnation that the rest of the state has, because the welfare median, as much as everybody wants to say, oh, you guys up there in the blue area, you guys are awful. Go fuck yourself, because the numbers are, you guys are really bad at this, right? In your own backyard. But it's way cooler and easier because all of our counties, we only need to challenge 3, right? That's the way they look at it. So when we talk about tax policy in particular, or local control.
Sure.
Because that's the other thing. Like, they love the chief. They all came out and said, new Governor Keogh, we love the new police chief. He's awesome. He's awesome. But we don't think that you people should be responsible for electing an individual that is their boss. We need outside control of your systems.
So I want to give a moment of empathy. I'll say ignorant empathy, because I don't live in the city and I don't live in the county and I don't live in the rural areas and I didn't grow up here. I've just kind of dipped my toe in all of them.
Sure.
The moment of empathy, and again, this goes back to what I hope I try to write about if and when and anybody sees anything I put on LinkedIn, is what you said is entirely valid, entirely accurate, and perfectly reasonable. What the legislators and the people who live in rural areas believe and think is perfectly valid, perfectly reasonable, perfectly okay for that. Hold on.
Except for the math.
Okay.
Except for the math.
Totally fine. And the reason why it's useful, now the intersection there is a legislative process, right? When they actually pass legislation that impacts is different. But I always look at this as an opportunity to say, okay, we are, and this goes also, I think, to the core of St. Louis, is there's this hope that if we just explain it enough, then people will get it. If we just tell people how great St. Louis is enough, then maybe they'll also do this.
Yeah, I don't buy that.
And I think this is it's the same dynamic we see in this rural, in this urban rural divide, because it goes back to that tiniest bit of evil, right? Like, okay, let me ask you a question, JB. Mm-hmm. Is there anything that is true in the way in the way that you grew up in Granite City, where you can say, yeah, you know what? If I was living in like St. Clair, Missouri, and the only time I go to St. Louis is to a Cardinals game, and despite hearing that the crime is down, I pull off the highway and there's a bunch of tents and a bunch of people milling around across from City Hall. It smells like weed everywhere, which is kind of odd to me. And then, like, I just have this general, people are blowing through stop signs, and it just kind of feels unsafe. Now,
nobody's going to deny the anecdotal realities of an individual trip. But here's the deal. When have you ever heard anybody from the city of St. Louis saying, or a homeless person that's in St. Louis that's like, you know what, Pike County just really is the place for me to be?
I think you're seeing it. So I'll give you an example. You don't hear that, but that's
Right.
that's an urban bias, right?
That's not an urban, but how many? The homeless population, they just simply have more downtrodden areas where they can aggregate in.
I wasn't speaking specifically to the homeless, but if you get out to like the county, like South County and stuff like that, you are starting to see, and I actually wrote about this recently. So when I first got to Wildwood, I discovered Herman by just simply taking a road trip, and I kind of ended up on 100, and I went across the bridge, and I'm like, what is this place? And all of a sudden, okay, Missouri's got a wine country, which we can spend another hour about, how we don't leverage these assets. But what you see is like Washington, 10 years ago when I got here, Washington was comparatively kind of a sleepy regional town. And it is now an industrial hub for that area. And what's happened, MoDOT just announced $75 billion to expand Highway 47 between Washington, St. Clair, and Union.
Subsidized by what?
Well, I understand. Okay, I understand that. But so I go back to the same conversation about the gas tax, right? And I think this is, if you want to understand kind of where I come from on this stuff, I think what's happened in our culture, right, is, and I'm not wagging my finger at you. It's kind of that attitude. So I look at it this way. It's okay if St. Louis subsidizes the growth in Union, St. Clair.
Oh, I was going bigger than that. That's an infrastructure bill.
Correct.
Subsidized.
So I think there is useful infrastructure, and that's where we kind of get off kilter, right? And I think if we want to touch on some of the more current news, right? There are things that are important for us to, I'm going to use the magic word, is socialize these costs. But not all of those things are inherently good. And I'll give you the example. We socialized the cost of running a highway system right through the heart of our city. Now, regardless of what you think about the whys and the politics and the whos and the whatevers, we all paid for that. Not us today, but when they built the highway system. And so there's things like that, which like that's okay. And I think I'm fine socializing those things at a state level or an interstate highway system. That is a national subsidy that is fine because you otherwise couldn't do it with JB and Dave rustling up some nickels to do it.
Yeah, no, look, I'm in favor of tolls. Here's the deal. You live in the state of Missouri, right? And if we want to drop a couple toll booths on Poplar or right across the stand span or frankly outside the St. Louis County line, or let me back up. Go all the way over to Kansas, put one right in the middle of Kansas City, right? Here's the deal. If you're from Kansas, you're from Denver, you're from Columbus or whatever, and you're just passing through on I-40, pay up, right? Simple as that. Because otherwise, we are going to sit around and wait for an infrastructure bill to be passed so that we can help subsidize. Because guess what? All these rural counties that we're talking about, they are never, ever going to generate enough GDP and put it away to be able to fix their own shit.
Sure.
The only way this stuff works is we have to look in the aggregate. And the aggregate, the money comes from one of two places. Either urban industrial areas that have true GDP growth, i.e. city, county, Kansas City, et cetera, or you got to look at it from a national perspective in which states like California are subsidizing the lowest 13.
Let me ask you about this because one of the other things that kind of conjures up in this conversation and that I think about a lot, when you go to business school and they teach you about externalities for like an hour.
Right.
I think a lot of people have lost the concept of externalities. And I start to see externalities in a lot of different places. And so I'll give you an example is I'm going to go meta on culture for a second. So I feel like I grew up in an interesting time between no social media and really expensive like camcorders to social media and like the reasonably cheap digital cameras to iPhones.
Well, I'll trump you there. I'm a Gen Xer. So I went from corded phones and newspapers to today.
But you didn't grow up like I don't think you came of age you didn't come of age during that iPhone era. And so
that wasn't until after college.
Yes. And so what I've started to think about, we're talking a lot now, and I think everything we've talked about can boil down to like two really specific things. Like how do we want to change St. Louis? You have to, my siren song is you have to tell and create a system that generates upward economic mobility. That was the point of bringing up $30,000 millionaires. When we start getting $30,000 millionaires in St. Louis, that's when we'll know we're onto something. The second one is we have a demographic winter that is slow moving. It is coming. And like, if you listen to Ness Sandoval up at SLU, it is like not great. And I think what's coming is that, the baby boom generation is large. And so the percentage of population decrease is going to accelerate, and then it'll kind of slow down and moderate as the Gen Xers get older. But this is going to be shocking. And what's happened over the last decade since the global financial crisis, as boomers have worked later, there's fewer Gen X and millennials in leadership positions. And if you pay attention to national politics, most of the political parties have not built a bench of leaders. So there's like a distinct gap.
Well, I blame boomers because, the numbers are really, really simple. The boomer generation has approximately 200 trillion plus in wealth, right?
Well, and here's what's happened,
and because they wouldn't let go, the younger families have kids that are like, well, fuck, I'm not going to have kids because I can't afford it.
That is one piece. And here's another piece is the American Institute for Boys and Men has done a lot of research about this where, and I'm, you kind of imagine there's these intersecting lines that have led us to this point, right? And this is three-dimensional problem. So you have the prevalence of cameras. So I imagine growing up, like I did a lot of wild stuff. And if all of that was like in 4K, permanently accessible and highly distributable, I don't know if we'd be talking today.
My kids, they don't even get an allowance, but it would be much higher because and you blackmail.
And you think about like, I think about, well, how does that change my decisions? Am I really going to go out to a bar? Like, I'm not going to go out to a bar. I'm not going to go to a party because and that's going to mean I'm not going to meet people. I'm not going to have this network. I'm not saying we got to go the other extreme, which is, we're going to talk about like, spring break 1999 kind of stuff. But we have created so much consequence, and I do blame baby boomers because this is the culture, this is the environment, this is the economy, this is the the level of consequences they gave us.
HOAs. I blame the boomers for HOAs.
Well, look, when you hear about, and look, I think sometimes it's useful to take anecdotal news that might be just sort of like internet news and an observation of one, and extrapolate something of that. Because if you have an observation of one that is getting popular attention, I think what I look at that is it communicates something underlying that's foundational, which is I think so much of what's happening now can be explained by fear, and not that scared fear like I'm too afraid to do anything, but there's so if we think about like the development and gentrification, what is the fear motive there to saying I don't want to do anything? If we think about why there's no visionary leadership in St. Louis, it's what happened? What does it say about us as a region and the leaders who've been here for 10, 20, 30, 40 years if all of a sudden a new idea comes in, or maybe somebody from somewhere else, and is highly successful? And it goes back to that story I told about my wife. I think there is an implication that if somebody else is successful, it means that we have failed and that we need to suffer the embarrassment, which I don't think is true. Well, but I think that it is also like true, right?
I completely agree. And I think this is where I want to bring it back to the state of Missouri and the MOLEG and their perception of the city. A couple of different things there. Number one, I don't think they have enough bench of individuals that have resume to prove that their legislative philosophies equate to the Goldilocks results that they pretend. For them, it's all performative, because the proof is in the pudding. We can look. You head I-70 across the state, turn left or right on any lettered highway you want, and you will see some shit, varying degrees of it. Right? Of course you're going to land in the Ozarks every now and then, and oh my God, look at those $1 million houses on the lakes. Well, guess what? The people that are there really are from Kansas City and St. Louis County. The vast majority, that's their weekend thing. But here's where I'm going with this. I don't like the idea that in Missouri in particular, these individuals are portraying that they have the solutions to what needs to happen here. They have no boots on the ground. They are relying upon the crime statistics. That's their low-hanging fruit, because they can't talk about the economics. They can talk about the population, but really all we're doing is cannibalizing ourselves. We're seeing the same number. St. Louis County and St. Louis City, if you add up the two numbers, it's been virtually the same number for about 40 years. You just have swing. You have people moving from the city to the county.
I think that number, and I reference back, Ness Sandoval has done some really terrific work on this, and he actually was at the city-county merger meeting. I think that has been the prevailing logic, and I think there's a lot of municipalities that are operating on that same assumption, except I think what's happening now is that the boomers are starting to enter that die-off phase. Yeah. And so if you look on there's two things happening. So
we are definitely flatlined.
The birth rate is, and I think, and I'm trying to remember, and he'd be really interesting for you to have on. The birth rate is declining. The boomers are starting to die off. And I mentioned earlier, in particular, the highest rates of decline in population are middle and lower income African-American families, in particular in North County and North St. Louis. Right. And they're not going to the county. They're going to Atlanta, Chicago.
They're assimilating.
Memphis. Well, no,
the opportunity.
Yes, and so it goes back to my kind of siren song. It's literally nothing in this city matters. Services matter, right? But like nothing matters here that we do. You could spend $1 trillion building, gold-plated Mecca in all of the empty lots in all of St. Louis,
or geospatial,
or whatever. None of it will matter until somebody somewhere wakes up in the morning and says, something's going on over in St. Louis, and I'm not really happy with my life. I'm pretty sure it will be better there. And as a California transplant who grew up in California, who spent time in Dallas during its huge growth phase, who's now here.
The Cuban years.
I can guarantee you, there's two things that happen, right? Because I think so often we get caught up in like what's happening today and we forget how long it took to get there. It's sort of the opposite of, how do you go broke? A little bit at a time, then all at once. it's sort of the opposite, I think, in cities. And I think the only reason people left California to move to Texas was not, the news would say, oh, it's all this liberal policy and stuff. If you live in California, that's kind of like it's like being in St. Louis. It's par for the course. Like, yeah, you got the political stuff and you learn how to navigate around it, right? It's the way they joke about, oh, it's the Chicago way. The reason they moved there is they looked around and said, okay, wait a minute. I'm paying a 13% state income tax. Now, what they have in California is a proposition that freezes your property taxes. So this is why, and this applies to commercial too. So this is why I see a lot of people just stay there forever. Or they never sell their property because if they bought it 50 years ago, their tax basis is like nothing, and now it's worth $100 million, right? But they, a lot of people, they left and they said, okay, like it's a little zany, but I've lived here. My property is super valuable. I can go to Texas. I can take my $1.5 million house, 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom, 1,800 square feet. I can move to Texas, spend a third of that money, even though I live an hour north of Dallas. I can get a house for $350,000. Double the size, and the schools are great. And I don't have to worry about all this stuff, and it'll be fine. And let me give you an example geographically, too. I always try to use this example, and people get really resistant because they think, oh, well, Texas has all this oil money, or there's something special about Texas.
No.
Texas as a state doesn't provide like much services at all relative to, I think, how much people assume it does given the size or everything else. Like the Texas legislature is really designed, I think, similar to Missouri in that it is not meant to do very much. Like most of what's meant to happen is relegated to the localities. And I'll just give you the example. Like if you, I need you to use a thought experiment for a second. So forget Fort Worth and forget kind of like the east side of St. Louis. This is St. Louis. And if I spread my hands out a little bit, this is like St. Charles, Warrenton, this is Troy, this is the Missouri River, this is the Mississippi, and this is the county, right? This is Dallas. And you can even map onto that, and I've done it. You can map on the growth patterns, the demographics, and to some level, what frustrates me historically about a lot of people's analysis in St. Louis is, that these people got forced to live in this area or that area. And don't get me wrong, I'm not diminishing the impact of redlining, and I'm not diminishing the impact of the migration patterns and exclusionary housing. If you broaden it out, right, outside of groups, and you just think about economic distributions, the cheapest place to build a subdivision is flat, former farm ground. Because you can put in all the utilities, it's already graded, to some degree. And if you look at the growth patterns, here's what's going to happen. The cheapest places to build with the highest margin
are the plains.
Are going to be the plains. And here's sort of what I would envision. And this is sort of goes back to the economic mobility and opportunity. The best thing the city of St. Louis could do is or greater St. Louis, is spend a lot of time and effort filling up St. Louis County and filling up St. Charles County and pushing it out to Warrenton and Troy, so much so that the regional stats start to look a little bit different. And because the economic opportunity out there starts to look like, okay, and I've seen this in Wildwood, it's okay, or Chesterfield, okay, my house that I grew up in and my parents bought for $400 is now $700. I'm not really excited about this suburban lifestyle. Maybe I'm interested in something different. I don't want to leave the region, and there's interesting things happening in the city. Where am I going to go? I'm going to go to St. Louis.
What you're selling is a gateway drug. You're saying that you go after the white bread, safe, suburban, good return on my track home, right, lifestyle. And once I realize that's a boring fucking landscape, and I don't have a lot of kids yet, because that's who we're describing. Because when we bring people in, because there's two types of kids that we're talking about. Kids that grew up here, went away to school, and they came back here because it's easy, and they're trying to figure out if they want to stay here.
Sure.
Right? And then there's kids that are not from here that are like, why the fuck would I come to St. Louis?
Well, let me ask you a question. Is it more or less likely that urban St. Louis will behave similarly or different to other major urban areas around the country over the last 40 years?
No, not until there's a tectonic shift in political ideology, specifically political ideas, period. And 2, you got to have the county playing ball. And number 3, you cannot have the Nick Shore rednecks out in the county or in rural Missouri trying to implement policy over a culture/community that they absolutely don't understand, that they're doing purely for political points.
I want to yes and you. Yes, you are right. And I think the other half of that equation is, and it's reflected in the way we talk about the city and county now. When people ask, kind of hypothetically say, well, I don't know why people wouldn't want to live in the city. We have, a low cost of living, affordable housing. We have the Arch, the zoo, and the city museum and the science center. We have all these amenities, and they sort of disparage the county like, oh, well, the county doesn't pay for any of that. They just kind of freeload and rent seek off of all the amenities that we have. One of the things that always churns around in my mind is it okay for that to be both true and false at the same time? And I say that because if it is true, right, there is some truth to that statement. But it is also false that the implication is that, and so people live in the county because they wish to do rent-seeking behavior without considering any of the other factors that might be involved. And I'll give you the example when we talk about like the earnings tax, right? The way that this gets dismissed is, these people just don't want to pay the 1% earnings tax. Nobody is not living in the city because of a 1% earnings tax.
No.
Like that's such a petty, small issue. I don't believe it, right? Like maybe there's somebody, I just don't believe it. But then when you start adding the math of, okay, most industry is small businesses, right? And small meaning 500 employees or less. The reason why most people don't want to live in the city is because there's a certain size or revenue size, right? Not necessarily headcount, but revenue, where you start to scratch your head and you say, I am paying 1% earnings tax, and so are all of my employees. And I am paying a 3.5% payroll tax. And I am paying a net earnings tax. Like I am paying all these other taxes and fees. And then guess what? When I have a problem or a legitimate concern, I'm sort of finger wagged and told that like, oh, you just don't get it. That's part of living in the city. And we want all, we're going to go to the public companies and address their issues.
Yeah. Okay. So this goes back to what I just stated a second ago. Until we have a tectonic shift in politicians with modern day policy and realistic, pragmatic approaches to bridging that divide, because at the end of the day, the decision makers are the ones that have the capital and have the means and are sitting in the boardrooms that make the decisions as to whether or not to move businesses and or move themselves into this marketplace. Everything else is subsidized. So when you have to talk to, what is it? The whole, Michael Jordan was rich, but the guy signing his check was richer. We have to figure out how to appease, without cutting off our noses to spite our faces, the individuals that are signing the checks. We have to be more approachable. We need to admit the downfalls as it pertains to crime. The county has a responsibility to own up to the reality of the fractured dysfunction that is St. Louis proper. Within, what is there, 98 municipalities within the county? I don't even know the number anymore. It doesn't matter. Every single one of them has their own popo and their fire truck. It's a goddamn mess.
Sure. Well,
so
I look at it. I want to suggest to you a few things, and I'm curious about your feedback. So I always look, we can certainly, I will acquiesce with the fact that there are certainly elected political officials where everybody kind of looks around and says, well, how did that happen? Right. And maybe it's a turnout issue, or, the weather wasn't good, or people just, what is it? It's just, we're just going to vote Democrat for everybody. And then everybody kind of surprises everybody. That happens. I think the interesting part, and where I would say, and I agree with this both from the Missouri legislature, from the county, administration, and from the city administration, is that the people that got elected, nobody in the city who voted, right? That's number one. Like if you didn't vote, you don't get a vote. You don't get a say in this conversation because you didn't do your job. The second part is that these are who people voted for, right? And I will admit that there's certainly a barrier where it's like, well, I kind of have like my own life, and like government service isn't like my calling, and that's fine. But then you still voted these people in. And so you get what you get. And I think, so there's a book we read my kids, and it's, you get what you get and you don't have a fit.
Yeah, I know that book.
And I love it. I mean, because the moral at the end of that is they try to use it against them. And they say, oh, well, he tries to bring it back and say, well, at school they say this.
Well, here's the thing that I would like to point out, and this is a difference right now. If we're, and we can wrap on this here shortly. Yeah. The whole blue-red divide in Missouri in particular, because everybody wants to paint. Missouri is a supermajority Republican state, period. End of story. It is. St. Louis, obviously, is a blue city. But when we think in terms of the perceived cray component of the parties, look no further than city of St. Louis.
Sure.
The progressive representative of this district, Mo 1, was primaried. Too much. Bridge too far. And when you go around the state, you cannot be MAGA enough, right? So here's where I have hope. I do believe that St. Louis, because of its institutions, because of its history, because of its population, because of its culture core, because of the people like yourself that are now in the region, that are here, institutions like Greater St. Louis Inc., I'll take the Kranzbergs, I'll take RAC, I'll take all of them, right?
Yeah.
Are constantly trying to come up with better ideas. These are constructive ideas with intent, as opposed to destructive policies for malicious intent. That's the difference in Missouri right now.
I think what you described, and I think with this too, is it goes back to that empathy point, is I think if you take the most, kind of extreme Democrat position in the city, or liberal or Democrat or however people identify, and you take the most extreme MAGA position, these are, if it's a flat circle, right? I mean, these are very close to one another on the opposite end of the spectrum. And I think to your point, and I think what you're getting at is, a lot of these folks have been given a little bit too much of a voice, and because the rest of us are doing stuff. And I think that's important. The other thing I would say is, you asked me a few questions and I want to touch on some of these. So the mayor in St. Louis is important today because we don't have a city administrator to professionalize and align all of the services. So my hope is that whoever gets elected, however it turns out, their priority is saying, all right, we are entering a little bit of a different era here, especially with a lot of fiscal uncertainty around the federal government and funding, which my personal belief is, I think there's a lot that will get sorted out in a very positive way that is just really uncomfortable for people to address, right? And I think it goes back to a lot of the same issues we're talking about here, which is, if I have been extremely supportive of these federal programs that maybe have, let's say, 50% good and 50% waste, am I going to be embarrassed to my friends or personally when it turns out that a lot of that was getting stolen? And it goes back to the fear, and it's the same fear here, which is, if the thing that I have made identifying about myself, whether it's being a civic leader, whether it's being a civic investor, if I find out that the ideas that I have been implementing or otherwise are wrong or have not worked, what does that mean? Like, what does that mean to me? And I think it goes to the heart of this soul searching that I think St. Louis needs to do, to your point, is, what is this place? And it goes.
The argument is it's the same. It's the opposite side of the exact same coin. I pointed out that Missouri is a super Republican state, has been for 20 plus years. Missouri falls in the bottom when it comes to life expectancy, education, median income, obesity, you name it. We are not a shining star on top of the hill, right? Then you come over to the city of St. Louis and you have a supermajority Democratic leadership for generations, right? And you see wicked population decline, crime rates, et cetera, et cetera. So it's like, it's the exact same fucking argument.
Yeah. Well, the attractiveness of Texas, right? And the Texas flag, come and take it, right? There is an element that the empathy that I would give somebody in the city, thinking about, like, why are people in rural Missouri kind of like this? Is the instinct is like, stay off my property, right? And these are people that turn property into 3 words, right? Property. And I think you just stop there, right? If the instinct is, I am, and this seems antithetical. It's, I am fine being miserable but independent than being like trapped in some programmatic system that is meant to offer me well-being and stability, but instead just makes me a cog in the machine. And again, my moment of empathy but not understanding is, I think more than enough people could describe more than enough stories of being recipients of a lot of these programs where, just think about like the unemployment insurance. Your job is essentially to file the uninsurance claim. Like, it takes so long. And when you start to extrapolate some of the things out in terms of public transit and the time tax of commuting, what happens if we're so destabilized, the lack of, what percentage of people in the States have less than $1,000 in savings? Like, you start to stack up some of these things and you can see the other side. It's like, I would rather be miserable with no services in the middle of nowhere where I can have my wood burning stove and all these other things. And it may not be great, but it's mine. Rather than, and from their point looking in, it's, yeah, you got all these great benefits, but none of it's yours. And you are now a captive to this system that at any moment can take it all away from you or deny it to you. And I think the overlap there is sort of this like anti-insurance zeitgeist right now, which is we can all sort of agree that we don't want to be all on our own, but we also don't want to be captive to a system that we're forced to fight to get everything that we feel like we deserve. And I think that, to me, that highlights a lot of the conflict in St. Louis, is that we're just kind of entracted in this, which is, and it's the way I feel, is there are so many tremendous assets in this region, so many amazing people, so much amazing talent, so many amazing buildings, amazing assets, amazing resources in the city, but it is just trapped by this intractable system and set of beliefs that insists on, it's the barrel of crabs, that it just insists on pulling it back in, either out of fear of what's on the other side, or out of kind of this desperation of, what I think there's a saying I kind of recently is we're all out of ideas and we haven't tried anything.
Well, we are drowning in whataboutisms, and it's like, you look, at the end of the day, none of you motherfuckers are really kicking out a good idea, and this is where we can close here, because I apparently I have kids that need to be picked up in a little bit.
We'll have to do version 2 some other time.
No, I just like it, it's one of those things. There are not enough big ideas. Everybody is kind of tiptoeing around, trying not to offend as many groups as possible, except for the Moleg. They don't care. They want to offend everybody because they feel like they are entitled to the, trying to activate the platitudes. Yeah. And that's just insulting. That's not creative either. Those are not ideas that are going to fix anything. It's going to wedge.
Yeah.
And I'm not a fan of that. Do I think that the city needs massive overhaul? 100%. Do I think it should be mandated by a bunch of dudes in Potosi County? No.
Totally agree. I'll close out my final thoughts with this. So my siren song is, if St. Louis wants to start doing anything important and meaningful, you have to create a system, and I'm not saying I have the exact answer, but I have some thoughts, for upward economic mobility. We should not be talking about anything else besides that this is a place for upward economic mobility. The second piece is, this has to be the best place in the country, if not the world, to meet a partner, form a family, have kids, and exist after that. And I don't know what the system is for that, but I guarantee you it's not what we got now, because that's what the data is telling us. Nobody is coming here and starting a family, with the exception if your parents are here.
You got to find a woman that still calls Riverport.
That's right. and I think the last piece is, it's a twofer. To your point is, I think there's too much glad-handing, too much nicety, and frankly, too much Midwest polite, which is frankly polite to your face and impolite behind.
Oh, yeah, totally.
We need a little bit more like New York severity, right? It's, I'm walking here. And I think more people need to be less deferential to the people who they perceive to be decision makers. These people are not as impressive as you think they are. They are concerned very much in a lot of cases about preserving their own power and their own little fiefdom. And by creating obscurity around what they do and how things get done, they are putting themselves in positions of power. And I think everybody who's listening to this and anybody who they share it with should be unafraid to ask some really hard and serious questions, both of yourself as well as of these people, and saying, what are you trying to do here?
Yep.
Like, when you propose these things, what are we trying to do and what are you trying to get out of it? And I think the more people who ask hard questions, the more people who are willing and frankly humble enough to be wrong and have strong beliefs that are weakly held and be open to new information, the better this region will be. And that's how you start deteriorating some of that closed mindset and welcoming these new ideas.
Yeah.
And until we kind of lay that foundation, I think you're going to continue to have people saying, I wouldn't take it if you gave it to me.
Yeah, I'm with you. I think the ideological regurgitation is it's so freaking annoying. I'm a Jerry Maguire guy, right?
Yeah.
Show me the money. Like, give me an idea, put it on paper, show me the mathematics, show me how you're going to connect the dots. You know what? And at that point, let's look at what is the cost, who is the benefactor, and are we stomping on anybody in the middle? Because if we are, and I get it, somebody always gets stomped on a little bit, but let's make sure their head doesn't go underwater.
Sure.
Right? Let's figure that out. We cannot do this from afar. There's just, again, at the beginning of this whole conversation, I painted a picture. St. Louis region has history, infrastructure, housing, culture, class, creativity, educational institutions, sporting institutions, you name it. No, and I travel all over the world. I'm sure you travel a lot too. Find a better city in America that has pound for pound a better culinary scene than we do.
We could go another hour because
you know what I'm saying?
Not only that, we have a culinary scene that is within 30 miles, like farm to table, you bet. I mean, we could have the farm to table industry. Now, that's not exactly a way to build a region, but that is a unique asset that we have that not everybody else can claim without shipping it in.
Well, that's a better PR headline than your crime rate.
That's what I'm talking about. And I think, I think too, all of these things, right? You have to get the foundation right to have a right brand, right? You have to have the combined experience and the brand promise be aligned with what you're saying. I think that the second part of that is if you asked 1,000 people in St. Louis, like what even cultural kind of motif, what is the basket of goods that you would define around St. Louis that is not, the Blues, the Cardinals, and City FC. I mean, those are features, not functions, right? That's part of the discussion we have to have and some of the choices we need to make. And I think when that alignment happens and when we start getting some momentum, I think we need to be unafraid to make some mistakes with it. I think we need to have 1,000 different experiments of things happening. And then what we cannot do is tell the story of St. Louis on a billboard and a printed brochure. You have to tell it just like this, across the table, far and wide, and in particular to people who are highly likely to come here. This is not a place, it's a place that should be welcoming to everybody, but it is not for everybody.
No.
If I'm an actor and I want to go to Hollywood, this is not for me, although we can develop that industry if we want. We need to figure out who the high potential transplants, people who will, what does that look like?
Until we have tax credits that allow Ozark to actually be filmed in the Ozarks. Hey, we're out of time here.
It's been a pleasure. We'll have to do it again.
David Messner, thank you for the Old Judge Company coffee, by the way.
Yeah.
So if you're listening again, the trinket suggestion kicked up by Mike Johnson. Real world Mike Johnson is coming to fruition. First gift, you will forever be remembered for that. We'll be in touch. I'll be following you on LinkedIn. I'll put the link to your account in the show notes, so anybody wants to read your writings, that they can go there as well.
Certainly be great.
And we'll do this again sometime soon, and more importantly, we'll go grab a beer as well.
Sounds good.
Later.
JP, pleasure.